I knew growing up as a Christian that there was something very different about this like historical person, Jesus, because he's condemning the Sadducees and Pharisees and scribes, which means he probably wasn't one of them, right?
You've been there. I had a big crisis in 2016, had to question everything. I went back and restructured and reconstructed my objective world through mathematics. And that's what caused me to look at math as a language and realize that it's a language of God. If there were ever a period of time in my lifetime where it literally feels like we are living into biblical prophecy, it would be now.
I agree. Yeah, it's very ominous and eerie almost to like read those scriptures about, in Matthew 24, Jesus describes, he's warning the Jews what's going to happen when Rome, he calls them the abomination that causes desolation. That's exactly what they were. They caused total desolation wherever they went.
Alan says, an eye can't see itself. A knife can't cut itself. A light cannot illumine itself, and a tooth can't bite itself. By the same token, consciousness can't perceive its full self. It has to create contrast in order for it to perceive itself. Aaron Abke, it is such a pleasure to be here with you. So excited to have you visiting from your hometown of Austin and here in Southern California. I know you've been on a bit of a road show these last few days, but thank you for taking the time with me here. You have such an interesting background. I can't wait to dive into it. So let's go ahead and just dive in if we could.
Let's do it. Thank you for having me, man. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure. It's really a pleasure. So let's talk a little bit about your history. I mean, you've got such an interesting background, the son of a pastor. How did you get into what you're doing now?
Sometimes I like to joke and say I left Christianity because I loved Jesus too much. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah, no, that definitely resonates.
Yeah. Super devout Christian my whole life, wanted to follow my dad's footsteps. And really the greatest blessing was the parents I had, I think. That I didn't grow up in a super dogmatic kind of religious environment, but my dad is a very heart-centered man after God's own heart. Same with my mom. Our whole family was very musical, all have perfect pitch and could sing 3-part harmony.
Yeah, I noticed during the meditation, you got the good baritone there.
Yeah, sang baritone growing up. So music was my life, and I wanted to be a worship pastor, got my degree in music at Oral Roberts University in Tulsa.
Wow.
And then
I was a music major too.
Oh, you were?
Undergrad.
Okay.
Performance major. Now I do a lot of work in music theory.
Yeah, you do.
And on tuning standards and stuff like that, purely mathematical and geometric. But
I just learned about the tuning. Our tuning is off. I didn't know that.
Yeah, so I got to get you into precise temperament tuning. It's unbelievable. Wow. I'll play it for you after. I channeled a new tuning method, and it's taken off like crazy.
Wow.
And there were people that were following me that wanted to debunk it. And then they actually tuned their pianos to it, and they played it, and they're like, and they were professors at universities, and they were like, whoa, this is really good. And now Philharmonic orchestras are tuning to this now.
That's the scientific method, right? You try to disprove it, and that's how you know it's truth.
Yeah. So I'd love to share that with you.
I would love to
hear about it. So thanks for bringing that up. So yeah, you were a music major, and you were probably head of the church choir type thing.
I directed choirs.
I'm sure you did.
Yep, that was my life. And I got a full-time job as a worship pastor in a church in San Jose.
San Jose, California.
San Jose.
At 23.
That's where I was born and raised.
No kidding. Wow. Yeah. So I lived in the Bay Area for quite some time. I was in Palo Alto.
Yeah. Yeah, I worked at Google for 4 years as a personal trainer.
I saw that. Yeah.
When I left the church, I went into fitness, was the only remaining passion I had left.
So is this how you were infiltrating Google? It's you basically went in there and I'm a fitness trainer, but I'm actually teaching everybody consciousness.
Yes. Yeah, that's where I discovered my path, was when I was at Google and started doing YouTube videos just for the fun of it. And they took off. The channel did really well. And I kind of thought, wow, I guess I could do this full time one day if I really invest into it. So I moved back to Colorado and started my YouTube channel full time, and 5 years later, here we are. But it really all began with breaking away from my religion of my upbringing at 23, because I just couldn't handle the internal conflict anymore. Of I don't know this God that you guys preach about. I don't know this Jesus you preach about. You know, this is an interesting rabbit hole, but the religion called Christianity that we have known on this planet for 2,000 years is not Jesus's religion. It's Paul's religion. And the Apostle Paul really stole the Christian faith from Jesus and the disciples.
Yeah, and when you look at the history of Saul, who became Paul, right, on the road to Damascus, you know, he kind of had a really interesting background that you wouldn't think would have ended up as, you know, an apostle of the church. And then off he goes with Barnabas, and then all of a sudden, like, he's the guy who's literally creating. It wasn't really Peter in this context. You know, a lot of the doctrinal aspects, especially about things like marriage, et cetera, you know, in Corinthians.
You got it.
This was all Paul.
I mean, Paul really scrubbed the feminine out of the gospel message. When you read like the Gospel of the Holy 12, the Essenes, they're very big on including the feminine always with the masculine. Jesus would say Abba, Amma instead of just Abba.
Yeah.
But then it's just Father in the basically Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's almost,
the original Aramaic was Abba, Amma.
But it's almost certain that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the canonical Gospels, were written by Paul's disciples, you know, years after. He was
not
executed.
by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
No, because they're written in Greek, not Aramaic. And who did Paul preach to? He preached to the pagans, to the Greeks, right? He was basically like 2 middle fingers to the Jews. You guys don't accept me. I don't accept you. I'm going to preach this gospel to the pagans. And the disciples were preaching to the Jews because they were trying to reform Judaism, get rid of the animal sacrifices and the blood cult aspect of everything. And Paul was like, hey, you don't need any of that stuff. You know, he said, the disciples mean nothing to me. What they are means nothing to me. He called Peter and James hypocrites. He had a huge feud with the actual people who knew Jesus. And he said, I have the expressed true revelation of Christ, even though he never met Christ in person. You know, it's very narcissistic. And his gospel won out over the next few hundred years because it's a way easier gospel. It's just salvation by faith. Just confess this guy as Lord and Savior. That's all you got to do.
Something isn't right. The ease of modern digital communication comes with costs. What are these colossal technology companies doing with our words, with our energy, and with our very beings? Can you imagine an event horizon where they use against us what we unknowingly gave? Orion emerges as an end-to-end quantum secure messenger that places the freedom of expression back where it belongs, with the people. More than a platform, it's a movement to reclaim your voice and freedom, a movement of people with profound ideas and a deep desire to help the human race. Let's get back to communicating meaningfully in our lives. It's time to rise above the surveillance, the shadow bans, and the censorship. It's time to free our voices. In a time when free speech and assembly are absolutely necessary, Orion stands tall, ensuring that you can free your voice.
But Jesus' gospel was unequivocally not that, right? Jesus said, don't you dare come to me and calling me Lord, Lord, and think you're going to enter the kingdom. Because when I was hungry, you ignored me. When I was in prison, you didn't visit me. And he says, get away from me, you who practice wickedness. That's what he's saying to Paul's gospel. It's wickedness, right? It's not about calling me Lord. It's about emulating me, doing what I would do, seeing me in others. And that gospel got scrubbed out. So like I was seeing all this at 23 and was like, I'm a Paulian, not a Christian. And I don't want to worship Paul, you know?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Have you ever seen the movie Life of Brian?
Yes.
I think it's hilarious.
It is.
Right. It's like, you know, if you haven't seen the Monty Python film, Life of Brian, I highly, highly recommend it.
Huge Monty Python fan.
This guy who looks like Jesus, everyone's like chasing him around. It's like, there he is. That's Jesus. I'm not Jesus. I'm not Jesus. You know, I think that's probably how Jesus might have actually been. You know, it's like, I'm not saying to worship me.
Oh, right? he told people not to worship him. People would try to worship him, and he was like, stop. Nobody's good but God alone.
Exactly.
But then Paul's like, no, it's all about worshiping him as Lord and Savior.
Yeah.
It's anti-gospel.
Yeah, it is. And I think this goes right back to the philosophy of the Essenes.
Big time.
Right, which was very consistent with this and what we have today in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Right, which I've actually reviewed the original Dead Sea Scrolls several times.
Oh, wow.
And it's fascinating. I love ancient texts. I learned Hebrew, and obviously today's language. A lot of people don't know that the language spoken in Israel today is literally the same biblical language, because they didn't have a language in 1948. They didn't have a language. So they had Yiddish and they had all these different, languages. So they had to go back to the original text and reconstruct the pronunciations. They weren't even sure about some of the pronunciations. And they had to use that language that was literally the language spoken before Masada went down. So in 70 AD is when Masada was everyone was starved out. The last 900 or so people that were left, that were wiped out by, the Roman garrisons. There's this big plateau that's about maybe 1,000 feet from the base, which is next to the Dead Sea. I actually was in a helicopter crash right by there.
Oh my gosh!
In 2006, it was crazy. I was like,
"You've got some divine protection, bro."
I've got some. I've survived three. I've survived 3 plane crashes and 1 helicopter crash.
What?
People think they're like, I don't want to fly with Robert, but there's one way to look at this and say, you know what, that's incredibly unlucky. The odds are not that you're going to end up surviving those that many crashes. Yeah. But the good news is the odds are I'm not going to survive those crashes. Yet I did. Lucky. I'm sitting here right here. Exactly. So I see myself as very lucky.
Glass half full kind of guy.
Exactly. I'm definitely a glass half full kind of guy. But there's always been a bit of drama along the way. And it was pretty scary. We went down in the desert right next to Masada. We were flying over Masada, which is this big plateau.
Is that where the Romans?
I'm not sure if it was related directly to the Essenes. I think it was just the last of the Jewish people.
Is it in Qumran?
It's not in Qumran. No, it's not in Qumran. This is next to the Dead Sea.
Okay.
So it's right. So is the Dead Sea Scrolls, and so is Qumran. But Masada is on this high plateau that the Romans couldn't get to. So they literally starved everybody out. They had a lot of food and everything
that was
up there.
their strategy.
That was their strategy. And
That's
then they finally built
Jerusalem.
a ramp. It took forever to build this ramp to get up to that thing.
Oh, wow.
And I was flying over the top of it, and I had a single prop helicopter. And, if you ever get a chance to fly in a helicopter, make sure it's got 2 propellers, not one.
It's good advice.
Yeah.
Good life advice.
Yeah. And so the engine stopped. Like literally stopped. I mean, it was still spinning for a bit. We went down in the desert and we had to walk like, I was lucky I had a big bottle of water with me. There were like 5 people in the helicopter with me. And we get out of it and they're like, okay, we have to walk like 10 kilometers.
So you all survived?
We all survived. Whew. We had to walk like 10 kilometers. They're like, well, at least we have water. And I'm like carrying this bottle of water. I'm like, who's we? I
got water.
That's right. That was my old life.
Finders keepers, guys.
That's right.
You guys know the rules.
That's right.
Were you piloting the helicopter?
No, I wasn't piloting it. There was another guy who was, thankfully. We would have been dead if I was piloting it.
I guess crashing in the sand is probably the best.
But I did learn how to fly. I did take flying lessons after I'd been in like 2 plane crashes. And I was like, okay,
time to learn how to fly.
Time to learn how to fly. So I took classes. I never got my license because that took a huge amount more time to go and get. But to actually learn how to fly was not that difficult.
Wow.
You from the first time you go up in a plane, a single engine plane, you can a prop plane, you can literally take off, fly the plane around, and land it without any real lessons.
Wow.
It's kind of unbelievable.
I feel like a helicopter would be easier to learn than a plane.
Yeah, but in some ways it's also got a lot more dangers to it too. So it's like, it's kind of an interesting thing, neither here nor there. But the whole story of the Essenes, you started digging deep into this stuff, right? I mean,
super deep.
What made you go into that? You wanted to understand the life of Jesus and where he was from and what sort of philosophical background he came from?
Yeah. Yeah, I've just had a magnificent obsession with the person of Jesus my whole life. And it's just been innate. I don't know why. He's been the most focal point figure of my whole life. And so when I left Christianity, it was very heartbreaking because it felt like leaving Jesus, even though I didn't. I never went like, oh, screw Jesus. A lot of my friends did that. A lot of my friends threw out the baby with the bathwater, but I left because of Jesus. I left Christianity because of Jesus, kind of like Gandhi's famous quote, if it were not for Christians, I would have become a Christian.
Yeah, that's right. Now, since you bring up Gandhi, have you ever studied about his time in India?
Not Gandhi particularly.
No, not Gandhi. I mean Jesus.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I read Notovich's book. Is that what you're referring to?
Yep.
Fascinating stuff. To me, that book parallels so perfectly with what we know of the gospel version of Jesus' story, where he's everywhere he goes, he's wagging his finger at the hypocrites, the priesthood, for their corruption of the law and deviation from the law and dragging people blindly into the pit with them type of thing. He did it to the Brahmins in India because of the idol worship. He was saying, you guys are making all these people work like slaves to create all these idols, and God can't be pictured in a living symbol because God's the invisible deity. He's everywhere. He's in everything. And so you're worshiping a deity in which God is not and subjugating the people in whom God lives to make it. You guys are hypocrites.
Wow.
And they're like, we're going to kill you. And he gets word of it and escapes.
Yep.
Then he goes to, I think, Syria. Same thing happens. He's like, why are you teaching people to worship the sun when it's the one God who makes the sun rotate, right? So I found it to be very congruent with the Jesus figure we know of. Very like big huevos, right?
Yeah.
Big balls, not afraid to call people out on their bullshit, but also a heart full of love and compassion and just always pointing back to God. So with the Essene path, it became fascinating to me because I knew growing up as a Christian that there was something very different about this like historical person, Jesus, because he's condemning the Sadducees and Pharisees and scribes, which means he probably wasn't one of them, right? So what was his influence? Where did he get these ideas from? Because his teachings are very, like, you're not going to find his teachings in the Torah. You're not going to find baptism in the river in the Torah. Like all these rituals and stuff he's practicing, where does he get them from? And this is the lost path of Jesus, was that he was an Essene master who was raised, I mean, it's in the Bible, right? Nazareth. The Nazarene sect of the Essenes was one of the two main sects. You had the Oseans to the south and the Nazarenes to the north. And there's a really interesting passage in the book of Acts where Paul is being questioned by the Sanhedrin. And, you know, to them, they don't know anything about the different Jesus movements and stuff. It's brand new on the scene. They're just like, we don't like all of these people worshiping this guy. They don't know the distinction between like Paul's gospel and the disciples' gospel. So they're like, you're teaching about Jesus to everybody. You must be the new ringleader of that Nazarene sect. And then Paul says, yes, I am indeed a follower of the way, he says. And he says, which they call a sect. So I'm like, right there in the book of Acts, he proves it that Jesus was an Essene from Nazareth, or a Nazarene Essene, because they accuse Paul of being the ringleader of that movement. So the original Christian movement was the Nazarene movement. And what happened is that it's a very sad story, actually, is that in 135 AD, so you had Paul's pagan Christianity, which is like a blood cult of confess Jesus, his blood is your forgiveness, you know. And then you had the Nazarene Jewish Christian movement of the disciples and Jesus's brother, James the Just, who Jesus appointed as the leader of his movement in the Gospel of Thomas. And their teaching, get rid of animal sacrifices, death and murder and the bloodshed of innocents is not how you atone for sins. You atone for sins by repentance and inner righteousness, baptism by water to cleanse yourself. That's what God wants, not blood.
Yeah, it was basically the next level. The gospel is the good news.
Yeah.
The good news is the Mosaic law is dead.
Yes. So it's like two completely different movements, right? And you get by 135 AD, again, Paul's much, much easier gospel to follow. Oh, just confess this guy and you're good. You don't have to be righteous, repent, just confess the guy. That movement blew up, right? Because it's an easier barrier to entry than Jesus' gospel.
Sure.
And so in 135
Jesus is
AD,
way harder. It's like, it's not just a sin of commission. It could also be sins of omission and also sins of thought, which is like, if you lust after a woman in your heart, that's just as bad as having, an adulterous affair with her.
Yep.
And so it's a much more nebulous thing to understand.
You got to be about that life, as they say. You got
to be in that frequency.
You got to walk the walk, not just talk the talk. In the book of James, again, Jesus's actual blood brother, probably knew Jesus better than Paul did, who never met Jesus. He basically calls out Paul's gospel very subtly in his book, the book of James, and he says, faith without works is dead. It means nothing. It's not what you say that matters. It's not what you even think about that matters, but your actions, what you do, shows what you really believe. So like Jesus said, if you don't help the least of these, you're not my disciple. Because you're not led by love yet. So in 135 AD, the pagan Christians were far outnumbering the Jewish Christians at that time. And so they finally kicked out the Nazarene movement from Jerusalem. So the Nazarenes had to flee to the south and the east and the west. And these different movements start to appear, like the Ebionites, that were flourishing and doing pretty well for the next 200-ish years. And then it was 364 AD, at not the Council of Nicaea, but the year before that, they had the Council of Laodicea. And in the Council of Laodicea in 364 AD, they made it illegal to be a Nazarene. And they said if anyone is caught observing the Sabbath, which was a big Essene practice, was to take a whole day, once a week, fast, pray, be with the Lord. They said if we catch anyone observing the Sabbath, you're going to be put to death. If we catch anyone practicing any of these Nazarene practices, angel worship and stuff like that, you're going to kill you. And so that's when we don't see Nazarene movements for the rest of history. They got wiped out from that point. And then the next year, Council of Nicaea, they put together the Bible.
Canonization of the Bible.
And they canonized it. So they
and
swept
lots
it
of
out.
books were basically excluded from that.
Yep.
Right.
And the
Gospel.
Hebrew gospel was almost included. If you read the history of the recordings of that meeting, they were considering the Hebrew gospel, which was written in Aramaic. It's also called the Gospel of the Holy 12. It's got all this Jesus talking about animal sacrifices being evil and not God's will. And, you can't have a religion where you say that Jesus was the final animal sacrifice that God needed.
And then still have it. Yeah.
To quench his bloodlust. And then Jesus himself is condemning sacrifices left and right. Doesn't look so good, right? So you got to scrub that out. So they didn't include it in the canon. And they included Paul's Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, instead.
Interesting. So, well, just rewind for a second, back to Jesus in India, right? So I had, in 2018, discovered and published a pattern on prime numbers. And I got 2 invitations. One was to the Vatican to teach this prime number pattern to some cardinals and such. And then the other invitation I got was to Dharamsala, India, to meet with Dalai Lama.
Wow.
And teach it to him. So I went to Dharamsala. I took Nassim Haramein with me. And then also I took a few other physicists and a stem cell researcher scientist by the name of Hans Kierstead. And we were supposed to have like 2.5 hours with the Dalai Lama. And it turned out to be, we ended up staying like 6 hours, 5.5 hours, 6 hours with him. He asked us to stay for lunch, which he's only done twice before in history, I guess. And
amazing.
And so he really hit it off with us. And it was a fascinating conversation. And during the course of the conversation, he said to me, in my house that I left back in Tibet, because he's exiled, right? He said, I had all the records and I read all the records of the story of Asa.
Isa, yeah.
And he said, Isa came from Palestine and he was a Buddhist monk. He was one of our high lamas, but he had got to a very high level at a very young age. And he told me the whole story about it.
So he's read the scrolls.
He's read the scrolls.
That Notovich read.
Yeah.
Amazing. Amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it says Jesus spent, I think, 6 years in Tibet.
Yep.
And just like it says, the passage in the New Testament where it says his parents look for him and they find him in the temple reading and teaching the priests, and they're amazed at this kid's wisdom.
Yeah, 12 years old.
Happened in Tibet as well with the Buddhists. They were like amazed at this kid's intelligence and his miracle working power as well. So I think what probably happened with Jesus is that he was an Essene prodigy. In fact, one of the main tenets of the Essenes was that they believed the only reason that man grows old and sick and dies is because of our deviation from God's laws. And so if we return back to harmony with God's laws, we'll return back to the original perfection we lost. So kind of some Garden of Eden stuff, right? It's a loose metaphor for what the Essenes believed. So they believed enough successive generations of Essenes, communing with, they call it the 14 angels, Malachim in Hebrew, which really just means like divine powers, right? Or frequencies maybe. Communing with those powers and embodying them in yourself through your daily communions will purify man's gene codes, really, and return us back to that state we lost. And what's interesting is that Josephus and Philo both said that the Essenes had extraordinary long life. Philo said almost all the Essenes were centenarians. And I think Josephus says the average age for them was around 120. And that's like double the lifespan back then in Israel.
I can believe it, though. I mean, I think it was Cyprus who has, one of the longest longevities. So in the Mediterranean, especially if you're living on a diet of olives, olive oil, and
figs
and all this, they tend to live pretty long lives.
And strict vegetarians.
Yeah.
So they were trying to back engineer the divine perfection that man lost through our sin and division from God's laws. And so Jesus, I think, they believed that eventually there would start being born among them these kind of like crystallized children who would be born kind of in that state of perfection with the knowledge we lost in their memory, right? Like less of that veil would be, they'd permeate through the veil from birth, remembering past lives and remembering sacred knowledge. And so it makes sense that they saw Jesus probably as a fulfillment of that prophecy, that he was the Messiah for them, which was not a kind of like savior character, but a fulfillment of what they believed was true, that we're returning back to our perfection. So I think that they probably were like, we need to steward this kid's life really well and send him around to the Buddhists, to the Chaldeans, the Zoroastrians, and the Hindus, and like get him.
Yeah, he visited Jainism. I mean, basically, he was. There's records of him in all of these places across India, and then also, like you said, for several years in Tibet.
Yeah. So the pieces of the puzzle come together, in those missing years. What was Jesus up to for those 18 years? The Notovich book, which is really not that long. It's maybe like 30 or 40 pages. But it just answers a lot of those questions in an amazing way.
Yeah, and there's a thing on YouTube you can watch too as well. That's quite good. But there's a few other books that have been written. One of them I picked up when I was in Dharamsala. And it was, the life of Jesus in India, is what it was called. And it was another sort of view on Notovich's work and more research behind it. I mean, it's quite good. I can't remember the name of the author right off the top of my head right now, but it was quite good. But what's interesting is if we kind of look at what's happening in the world today, right? All of these topics are kind of still around, right? As like major topics. I do a lot of work in Egypt, and one of the things I've been studying a lot of as well is the time of the Holy Family, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, when they fled to Egypt.
They went to Egypt.
And they actually went to this place called Ma'adi, which means calendar. Now, this all came out in my work on Leonardo da Vinci, because in his reference letter he wrote to the Devatdar of the Sultan of Cairo, Babylon. Actually, didn't use the word Cairo, used the word Babylon, because that was the name of the city right? And it goes on further saying, yes, there's also a town called Cairo, but in Greek, that's pronounced hero.
Interesting.
Yeah, right. Interesting.
Yeah.
And so it says the twain are, the same, but not two towns. They're basically, old Cairo is called Babylon. So the original name was Babylon. At the time of Jesus, there was no Cairo.
Yeah.
It was just Babylon. And this Babylon was on the shores of the river Gihon, which is the name of the Nile River in the Bible. So according to Josephus and also according to Herodotus, the name of the Nile was originally Gihon, which was one of the four rivers. Where the four rivers meet is in the Bible as the location of the Garden of Eden.
Yeah.
And so if you go through the history of like Noah, right? Noah had a son named Ham. His son was Cush, who became the leader of the Cushite people. The Cushite people lived from Ethiopia, Somalia, Sudan, all the way up to northern Egypt. And the Cushite kingdom had control of Egypt. These are known as the Black Pharaohs for a long time.
Okay.
Right? And they were never in Saudi Arabia on the peninsula, and they were never, in any historical sense, in Mesopotamia. So the Cushite people were the ones who were supposed to have built Babylon. So the story doesn't match.
Yeah.
Right? And this is going to be the subject of something that I'm doing with Gaia on their next Ancient Civilizations conference, because we think we found where the original Babylon was. And we also believe that the Tower of Babel was right there, and it's a place called Abu Rawash. So this was a 600-foot high pyramid, 120 feet higher than the Great Pyramid.
Wow.
And it's exploded. And the entire thing was made of rose granite on the casing stones, which is very expensive to do. It had a 60-degree slope angle because it sat at a 300-foot higher elevation than the pyramid complex does. So this would be the perfect place to build the highest tower in the world.
Yeah, yeah.
And there were two pyramids there. But Interestingly, they also match the pineal and pituitary glands. So the three pyramids on Giza Plateau represent the throat chakra, and it's 3 layers.
Are those the actual chakra points on the earth?
So there's 2. So we've got it's as above, so below, right? So the entire Nile from Abu Simbel all the way up to the tributaries that empty into the Mediterranean would represent the Kundalini spine of Osiris, and each of the temples along the way, from Luxor for the solar plexus, Kamumbo for the sacral chakra, right? Philae for the root. The root was actually at Abu Simbel, but then you have 12 chakras along the way. So it's not 7. It's actually more advanced. And so each of those temples are all dedicated to Osiris and Isis, but they all actually have slight differences because they're representing each of the chakra points along the way. They're right in the correct positions. The throat chakra of Earth is also the Giza Plateau.
Okay,
so
I've heard that.
If you look at the entire Earth, there's these centers, right? They're on the ley lines. And the Giza Plateau is the throat chakra of the entire Earth.
Yeah.
But it also happens to be the throat chakra for the Nile. And it's controlled by Orion. This is why Orion is a constellation that's in Taurus, right? It's actually in the Taurus constellation. There are 3 deacons in the Taurus constellation, which would be, the Egyptian year was cut into 10-day segments. So you have Auriga, Eridanus, and Orion. Those are the 3 that are within Taurus constellation.
Okay.
And so Taurus has always been known to be in control of the throat chakra as well. Represents the alpha. It represents alpha omega as well. The alpha is the Apis bull, and the omega is the Hathor, which is the mother of the Apis bull, right? But it also just represents the different age stages of the divine feminine. So you've got Nephthys, which would be the maiden. The maid is Isis, right? The matron is the Hathor. And then you've got Nut and you've got Sekhmet, who represent kind of the happy or the angry grandmother. So Sekhmet would be the angry grandmother form.
Interesting.
But they're all connected. They're just different age stages as we look at the divine feminine living its life out.
Oh, I see.
And you could say the same is kind of true for Horus, who's supposed to be, and you've got the Horus bird right over your head. And basically, Horus is supposed to be the reincarnation of Osiris.
Okay.
Right? So these are just different stages, again, of life. And then eventually, another stage is Thoth. Another stage is Ophiuchus, right, which is the Asclepius. And that's when you get the rod of Asclepius or the staff of Hermes, and you start to get wisdom and get control of the Kundalini. Well, the Holy Family fled after the extermination order by Herod, right, for the firstborn male children because of the prophecy.
As the legend has it.
As the legend has it, and shows up in Luke, the story of Luke. We all read the story at Christmas time. Well, now maybe not anymore because it's Paulian.
Yeah.
But,
get those Paulian books out of here.
That's right. But what's interesting is that the Holy Family ended up going to Mahdi, and they went down the Nile, because southern Egypt is the feminine aspect of the Nile. Northern Egypt, or what's called Lower Egypt, it sounds opposite because it's about elevation. The Lower Egypt, it would be more the masculine side. That's where Giza Plateau is and everything. And what's interesting is that you can find a lot about the stories and about the Coptics. So along the way, there are several old cathedrals and monasteries that are all Coptics, that are all from like the 1st, 2nd, 3rd centuries AD, which would be around the same time as the Essenes. And so the question I was going to ask you is, have you looked into the Coptics? Because, Jesus spent a lot of his life in Egypt, in that area around Mahdi, which is also not far from Heliopolis, which is also called Maitreya. Maitreya is the Buddhist word for a Messiah. It's a different, it's a slightly different Messiah concept. It's a wealthy Messiah. He's actually got this mustache, and he's like adorned with all kinds of nice stuff and everything. And it's supposed to be the concept of a more abundant form of a Messiah that's supposed to be in this day and age, right?
Interesting.
Even though I tend to believe that it's more a representation, that I don't really believe that it's going to be about there's a Messiah coming for us. I actually believe it's a collective awareness shift
For sure.
And it's the 144,000 that then extend to 144 million. And I'm not really of the mindset that we're all going to be seeing, Jesus come down.
Right. I was going to say it's the same idea as the second coming of Christ is not a physical return, but a Christ consciousness,
it's a Christ consciousness
for humanity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we're looking at it from the age of Aquarius, right? Which is, as the Bible reference states, right, where it talks about, look for the man bearing water going into the Last Supper. I actually believe the Last Supper was not actually in Jerusalem, but it was in Mahdi. And that Jesus and some of the apostles were actually in Egypt before they went back to Jerusalem. And, were there for Palm Sunday and everything. And he returned into Jerusalem riding on the donkeys, right? And the palm fronds and the whole story that we have about that. But the Last Supper, I believe, is actually related directly to Mahdi, this place called Calendar. And Da Vinci put that in his works. He basically said he was there to survey the great Mount Taurus, and it was all encrypted. But the original name of the Great Pyramid was Bull Mountain.
Wow.
So Mount Taurus, it's a representation of Osiris, right? So today we've got all of these things playing out because we've got the conflict going on in Israel and Gaza right now. We've got certainly lots of calls for, okay, let's go ahead and get into a war so we can justify taking over the Al-Aqsa Mosque and basically...
There's the red heifer thing going on.
Okay, now that's a weird story.
Yeah.
That's so crazy you just mentioned that because, so for those that you don't know, right before the eclipse, right? So this was the day before the eclipse, there was a big sacrifice altar set up in Jerusalem for the red heifers. Now, the red heifers were supposed to be this thing that would be sacrificed in a blood sacrifice by these, very Orthodox Jewish,
They're
rabbis.
still doing it.
They're still doing it. And they have to find 5 red heifers.
Perfectly red.
Perfectly red with no white hair, no black hair, not more than one. They can only have up to one different color hair on their entire body.
Hilarious.
And so they searched the entire world for this red heifer thing, which of course is a reference as well. These have to be virgin cows, right? They're basically virgin cows.
I heard it came from Texas.
Not just anywhere in Texas. Came from my parents' backyard.
No way.
I'm not kidding you. 4 out of the 5 red heifers came from Rockwall, Texas, which is where my parents live, and they live right next to a farm with these heifers on them.
Wild.
I was like, what the heck kind of matrix is this?
What does it mean?
What does it mean?
What are you telling us?
That's right. Well, another thing that's crazy is that if you notice, the time of the eclipse in Austin was at 1:37 p.m., right? That was actually the apex of it. That's the number of God.
Is it?
137 is the fine structure constant. It's the constant in mathematics and physics that's dimensionless, that separates light from darkness. It's the one number Carl Sagan put on the Voyager spacecraft to tell other civilizations, if they ever found the Voyager spacecraft, that we understood the nature of light separating from darkness.
Wow. I never heard that.
Yeah, it's called the fine structure. Literally, one of the most famous physicists of all time, his name is Richard Feynman, said, we know that God wrote this number, but we don't know how he pushed his pencil, right? It's the most mysterious number in physics. When Wolfgang Pauli died, he knew he was going to die. He was in a hospital, and they put him in room 137. And he's like, this is it. And the name of the constant is alpha.
Okay, that makes sense.
So literally like alpha, omega kind of thing. Even the number of elements in the periodic table of elements, Richard Feynman posited, is actually 137.
Oh, yeah.
Not only 118. We're missing 19 elements that we still haven't discovered yet.
Have you studied Bob Lazar's stuff at all?
Yeah.
What was the element number from...
I think 115.
115.
Yeah.
Or 116, something like that. Yeah, that makes sense.
I mean, it's like the special one that's got all these alien characteristics.
Yeah, it creates its own gravity field.
Yes.
And yeah,
exactly.
Perfect for UFOs.
Yeah, perfect for UFOs. So what's interesting, though, is you see that pyramid shape there. That's one of the pyramids at Abu Rawash.
The 60 degree.
It's 67. This one's 67 degrees. The other one's 60 degrees. The one behind it. So they're immediately adjacent to each other at a diagonal from each other. But what's fascinating about it is that if you looked at the eclipse... The eclipse, you take the trajectories of all 3 eclipses from 2017, 2023. So it was August 2017 which was a huge consciousness expansion related eclipse that, it passed over here. We were 61.8 degree, right? Your wife's birthday is June 18th. So 618, it was exactly the golden ratio degree of totality here in Newport Beach, California.
Wow.
And then the other eclipse trajectory was in October of last year.
Yep.
And then the last one was just last week. Right. Well, the three, when you overlap them, made a very large shaped letter A across the country.
Wow.
Alpha. Right. But it wasn't just any alpha. It made exactly that triangle cut in half.
With the degrees and everything.
And that happens to be the perfect triangle. What makes something perfect? That's when its perimeter, which is a 5, 12, 13 proportion, it's Pythagorean triple, its perimeter is exactly equal to its area. So 5, 12, 13 is a perimeter of 30. 5 plus 12 plus 13 is 30. And if you take 5 times 12 to find the area and then take 1/2 of that, it's also 30. So it's like a portal. And it's also the exact shape of how time works. So you've got 30 seconds and 30 seconds for the masculine side of 1 minute and the feminine side of the minute. It's like a death and birth recycle, right?
Never
That goes back
that.
and forth for time. It's like a pendulum, right? It's like a perfect pendulum. And it made the exact proportion. And the crossover point was not far from Austin, which was very interesting.
I saw that, yeah.
Yeah. And the other crossover point was over Little Egypt. There were 7 cities that the path of the eclipse went through. The 7 cities there were 2 cities that did this, were the city of Salem, the name Salem.
I saw that.
Was
And
crossed
then
7 times, and Nineveh. And I was just in Aswan with Matthias Di Stefano, and I got this download while I was there that the original Nineveh was Aswan.
And what's Aswan?
Aswan, Egypt. It's basically where the southern Egypt.
Oh, that would make
it's
sense.
It's not far from Philae.
That would make sense.
Right. And in the Bible, it actually talks about, Nineveh falling like its neighboring city, Philae, did. So we know that it was actually in Egypt, not in Mesopotamia.
Right.
So this whole thing now, I wanted to ask you about this. First of all, the sacrifice of the 5 heifers, right? The 4 of them from Rockwall, Texas.
Yeah.
What is the significance of this? And it seems like somebody's really pushing for, that was supposed to be ushering in the new Messiah, the Messianic age, as well as this concept of, the rebuilding of the temple on the Temple Mount.
Yeah.
So it'd be the 3rd temple.
Yeah, it would.
So the first was Solomon, second was Herod, right? And then those were both destroyed.
Was the last one destroyed in 70 AD?
The final, except for the Wailing Wall, right? The Wailing Wall is still there. They still have the same trapezoidal shaped, blocks that are on the Wailing Wall. I've been under there. When the Romans basically finished the children of Israel, I guess, the Judah population. It was a tribe of Judah.
Which is a crazy story, by the way.
It's a crazy story.
It's nuts.
It's totally nuts. But so what are your thoughts on this? There seems to be a lot of wars and rumors of wars. If there were ever a period of time in my lifetime where it literally feels like we are living into biblical prophecy, it would be now.
I agree. Yeah, it's very ominous and eerie almost to read those scriptures about, in Matthew 24, Jesus describes, he's warning the Jews what's going to happen when Rome, he calls them the abomination that causes desolation. That's exactly what they were. They caused total desolation wherever they went. He's warning the Jews about no one knows when they're going to come, but the Essenes sometimes
This is when he says it'll fall in 3 days and it could be raised again.
Yeah, not one stone will be left upon another. He says, I'll raise it up in 3 days once it's destroyed. And he was referring to the temple of his body. But the Essenes get a bad rap sometimes for being an apocalyptic sect or group, because in a lot of their Dead Sea Scrolls and books and writings, they would talk about this end times or end of the age. And a lot of that's what the Paulian Christian movement of the West took to make the rapture BS with. And, oh, no, he wasn't talking to the actual people listening to him. He was talking to Christians 2,000 years in the future. It was all metaphorical.
Okay.
It's how did we get this? So he was talking to the real Jews that were going to live through this apocalyptic event. He said, it's going to be an event unlike you've ever seen before, and the earth will have never seen again. And when you read the 70 AD story of how they sacked Jerusalem, he was not lying, because they slaughtered 1.1 million Jews in essentially a day, and they destroyed the temple. It was the end of the Jewish age under Rome.
Yeah.
Everything he said checked out perfectly. And so, like, a lot of this apocalyptic stuff is coming back around because the Essenes were not some kind of apocalyptic cult or something. They were very tapped in to the energy of the world they lived in, right? They saw this constant fighting between the Jews and the Romans, and how the Jews were like, we're the chosen nation, we're going to overthrow Rome. And you had these zealot movements of Jews that would slaughter Roman armies in the desert, and it was pissing the Romans off. And so the temperature was rising, and the Essenes were like, hey, we're coming to the end of the age of darkness. Because again, they believed that the Jews had wandered so far away from God's laws with all this animal sacrificing and stuff, that they had basically allowed Satan to take over their entire religion. And they were doing the will of Satan, not God. And so they believed that that's why they estranged themselves from Jerusalem over to the Dead Sea and Qumran. Like they literally preferred to live in this burning wasteland than to live in the nice oasis of Jerusalem, because of the evil they believed was going on there. And so they were prophesying what they probably intuited and felt was coming to a head, that, hey, these Jews are not realizing the beast they're poking, and they're going to get wiped out. It's going to be the end of the age of Judaism, and we're warning you guys about this, and that's what happened. They were completely correct in their predictions. And so I think it's interesting, Robert, that the Essenes are coming back on the scene right now, and people are getting into their works more. I certainly have been just passionate about studying the Essenes over the last few months. And I think it's for this reason. I think that very much like in the days of the Essenes in the first century, they could feel the frequency of the planet, that there was this purging about to happen. And I think it's also about to happen in our world today. And it's going to look different. Maybe it'll be more of a technological apocalypse or something like that. But there's going to be this big fourth turning into this new age where old systems are going to fall. The Babylonian systems are going to fall. The age of darkness is going to start collapsing, and it's going to be tough. It's going to be uncomfortable. But as Jesus says in Matthew 24, for the sake of the elect, he says, who follow God and God's ways, those days will be shortened for them. They'll be spared. But those who didn't follow God's ways are going to get caught up in the maelstrom, and it's not going to be good for them. I think there is a parallel there, interestingly enough, with, it's not a rapture, let's say, but it is a prediction about these cycles, as you know, that we repeat the same cycles, usually around every 2,000 years. So there's just a lot of interesting parallels there to me.
No, absolutely. And it's related directly to the zodiac.
Exactly.
And so one of the things, I don't know if you saw this recently, but CERN came out with an illustration of how the depiction of time could look. And it was a Mobius strip. That looped on itself. It looked like a figure 8.
Oh, like the Ouroboros?
Like the Ouroboros. And if you think about it, that is exactly what we live.
Yes.
Because
100%.
we're going through procession of equinox and precession at the same time. Precession means to go backwards. Procession is to go forwards.
Right.
So we go from, Capricorn to Aquarius, from Aquarius into Pisces, Pisces to Aries, Aries to Taurus, Taurus to Gemini, Gemini to Cancer, Cancer to Leo, and so on. But in the long sense, as we go forward on each month, we're going back an equal amount that's like a Klein torus. Like you've heard of Klein bottle, right? Which is a bottle that involutes within itself. Right? Or a Mobius strip is when you take a piece of paper and you twist it 540 degrees. And I could make it like a little wristband, right? A little piece of paper you do in school. You twist it 540 degrees, and then you could put a little car on one surface and it'll end up on both surfaces. Both the front and the back side of it. That's what DNA is. That's also
Double
what
helix.
time is. Time is a DNA helix.
Makes sense.
That actually is a 24 strand, possibly even more. And we're now transitioning as we understand the geometry of this. I've taken large groups to Israel before all this conflict stuff started, and I used to love taking groups there. And I was one of the co-hosts for a group in 2018 before I went to Egypt and found the Alpha Omega. And I was drawing Alpha Omega in my notebook like incessantly.
Wow.
before I discovered it on the rim of the sarcophagus that week.
It was coming through.
It was coming through hardcore, and it actually came through the night before because I had a state dinner function in Jerusalem underneath the Dome of the Rock. So there's a place called Zedekiah's Cave that you can only enter from the Jordanian side. And it's also Solomon's Quarry, where they got all the limestone to build the Solomon's Temple. And I was in there, and it looked like an Illuminati dinner, no joke. We had like this long table. There was a giant harpist, like this giant harp, and this woman playing it and everything. And I was hosting, so I said, hey, I need to find the bathroom. And instead of going to the bathroom, I jumped the rope that said do not enter, and I went deep in the cave.
Oh, that was your exit plan.
I wanted to see where the Ark of the Covenant had been hidden.
Wow.
For a really long time, because I knew it was in that cave.
How'd you know that?
Because historically, that was when Zedekiah, basically, it was during the reign of King Zedekiah, and Nebuchadnezzar came and attacked Jerusalem in 587 BC. They hid the Ark of the Covenant. They took it out of the temple because the temple was destroyed. It was the first destruction of the temple.
Right.
And they put it underneath the cave, in the cave of Zedekiah. And it was hidden there for a long time. Maybe even as long as some believe it was taken at that point by, Knights Templar to other places. Some believe it was taken down to Ethiopia, right? And so there's been this whole hunt for the Ark of the Covenant. There's even a Indiana Jones movie about this, right? So, but I wanted to find the place where the Ark had been hidden. And I went deep in this cave, and I found a mound that had turned from limestone to quartz crystal. That's not something you can easily do, right? It takes thousands of pounds of pressure to get quartz crystal to be turned into that from limestone. Right?
Wow.
And I found this mound that was all quartz crystal. I got it all on video, and I looked down on the exact spot where I found the mound, and there was like steps to it as well, and there was an Alpha Omega carved in the floor.
No way.
So I later found out that that's the exact spot that the Royal Arch Freemasons go to worship or commemorate the Ark of the Covenant. They go there every year on May 6th. That was the night I discovered it. They'd left a few hours before me.
Oh, wow. So you just lucked out.
I just lucked out.
You could have walked into a Freemason ritual. Dude.
I could have walked into a Freemason ritual.
And we may not be having this conversation right now.
Yeah, that's right. Who knows, right? But the very next day, I discovered the Alpha Omega on the rim of the sarcophagus.
The next day?
The next day. I went to Egypt, took a flight in the morning. I was there with 12 of my buddies, and I had this memory being in there when it was placed on the rim. And then I looked at the exact spot where I had the memory, and there it was.
You had a memory of it being on the rim of the sarcophagus?
Yeah, being placed by a blue-green light. And
just like a fuzzy dream.
I just remembered it was like real. Like I'm sitting here with you. I literally was in a different time space for about 3 seconds.
Oh, wow.
And I remembered seeing Alpha Omega being pressed in the rim of the sarcophagus, right, with some device, because you can't chip it because the whole thing is made of, mainly quartz crystal. It's like 70% quartz crystal.
Is it really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Granite is literally 72, I just found this out yesterday, 72 to 77% silica, which is super brittle.
Yeah.
It'll shatter as soon as you take any kind of hammer to that thing.
Yeah.
So I got the Egyptologist, and I was like, well, have you guys seen this before? And they're like, did you make this? They were freaking out. They were totally freaking out. And I knew that everything was going to shift after that. And then one discovery led to another, and it just got more and more and more. And, now we're basically deciphering all the walls and everything that relate to the zodiac stuff that you saw earlier. But the point is that this whole notion of Alpha Omega is really this representation of the separation of light from darkness, and then the reemergence of light and darkness, right? And so it seems like we're going into this new age, right? And this new age is very much tied to what Christ was a great example, and emulates for all of us, which is this notion of Christ consciousness.
He was the forerunner.
Yes. And so it's interesting to me because I was always also, like you, a big fan of Jesus, right? I thought he was like the ultimate, badass.
Ultimate spiritual gangster.
Total the OG of OGs. And I never really resonated with the story in the Old Testament of Jehovah, right? Which was kind of this mean God, right? It was like, I'm a jealous God, don't put anything else before me.
Can I touch on that?
Yeah.
There's a really fascinating topic on this about the original law. It's called the Holy Law, or sometimes it's called the everlasting agreement. When you study the Torah, the laws of Moses, and especially the original Aramaic writing of them, there's a lot of things were changed when it was translated to English, and they're small tweaks, but they have huge significance because, as you know, Hebrew is a very simple language. It's very straight to the point, hard to misinterpret, versus English, which
it's like Chinese. Chinese and Hebrew are kind of very staccato and very abbreviated language. You can speak them very fast.
Yes.
You know, you don't have to have all these participles like I am going to the store. That's a lot of words and a lot of syllables. In Chinese and Hebrew, it's just I go store.
I go store.
Yeah.
Yeah. So harder to misinterpret. So there's a lot of room, there's a lot of wiggle room, right? If you're translating Hebrew to English to interpolate words that maybe weren't actually there or intended to be there, to extrapolate things. And so there's this idea that there was the original law, the holy law, which the Essenes write a lot about, especially in the Essene Gospel of Peace. And it's basically the law of free will. It's on the positive polarity of consciousness. It is the law of do no harm. And Jesus summarized it as saying, here is the one law. Love the Lord your God and love your neighbor.
Mind, and strength.
Yep. And the second is like it because it's the way you act out that law. It's love your neighbor as yourself, which is do no harm. If you wouldn't harm yourself, you can't harm your neighbor. That's the positive polarity. The negative polarity is do what thou will. Do whatever you want.
It's very Aleister Crowley.
Yes. So that's the holy law is do no harm, honor and respect the free will of all living beings, including animals, nature, etc. And so if you deviate from the holy law, if you cannot follow the holy law, then you come under sort of like the spiritual jurisdiction of lower beings, Yahweh, Jehovah, which are very like karmically punishing beings. They like to take the gloves off, so to speak. And those are the gods that suddenly appear in the Old Testament after Israel can't follow the original law they were given, and they start worshiping idols and stuff. Then it slowly becomes Jehovah and Yahweh you're hearing from. But the original Hebrew name, and maybe you know this, of the creator, the most sacred name, is pronounced Ahiye in Hebrew. And that was the name, like you shouldn't even speak that name if you're not following the holy law. Maybe
that's the abbreviation of Aye, Eshe, Aye.
Maybe.
Which is I am that I am.
Yeah, that would make sense. So that's where the Israelites came under the jurisdiction of lower beings like Yahweh, who now you have to get hundreds of laws to follow. Now you have to become like a slave to this law system because you can't follow the one law. And remember, Jesus said, on this one law hangs all the law and prophets of the Old Testament.
Yeah.
Love God and love your neighbor as yourself. And so it's like almost like the punishment of violating the holy law is that you have to be subject to all these laws that have very severe consequences. And in the Essene Gospel of Peace, Jesus says, the closer a law is to God, the fewer there are. The farther from God a law is, the more there are. And so Moses had to give
We should use this concept for government.
Oh, 100%. 100%. How many laws do we have, bro?
Oh, my gosh.
30,000 plus.
There's never less laws. There's always more laws, right? That's the problem. Why governments always get bigger and bigger and bigger until they need a reset.
Because the more laws you have, the more control you have. You can control every aspect of human behavior if you can make infinite laws, right? In the law of one, Ra even says there needs to be some law structure in place. That's good, but too much control is inherently negative. So there shouldn't be many laws. And law in its spiritual essence is simple.
It's like if every car is an ambulance, then what's the emergency?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, if you've got a law for everything, then what's the purpose of any of the laws?
What's the point? Yeah, it's just a control device at that point.
I believe in the concept of teaching people correct principle and letting them govern themselves. And I think that's, I hope, and where I believe the earth is going to go. I think, I spoke last year at United Nations, and I spoke there the year before too.
No way.
And I spoke at the CEO summit that they have there, and all the secretary generals are all there and everything. And I spoke, and I gave a kind of controversial talk the year before, and I was shocked when they asked me to come back and speak again. And this time, I literally took the gloves off, and I was like, how many of you here believe that the world still needs more overlords?
It's a good question to ask at the United Nations.
Yeah. And you will not believe how I got mobbed after that speech in a positive way.
Oh, okay.
Because people were like, oh my gosh, this is so right. It's like the overlords are tired of being overlords even.
Mm-hmm. It's got to be exhausting.
It's got to be exhausting. It's like, it's like on Shrek, the guy that's the evil king, he's like, this is hard.
Yeah.
It's really difficult to be the evil king.
I almost know his name.
Yeah.
Starts with an F.
F, yes. What's his name? Farquaad.
Farquaad.
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you.
Right.
Lord Farquaad.
Thank you, Jason. That's right. Lord
Farquaad.
That's right. So, I think that this is what's happening. We're going through this shift right now, but I feel like we're at another intersection point. It's exactly what you just described related to the law of one, right? Which is that if you're going to choose the lower consciousness, then you will be subjugated by that lower consciousness overlord.
The Matrix.
And so I feel like we're at this big intersection right now, which is
we are.
A lot of people understand, at least they believe they understand the concept of Christ consciousness, which is predominantly, here's the one great commandment. Yep. Love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, might, mind, and strength, and love thy neighbor as thyself, right? Great. But there's another provided, however, that judge not lest ye judge yourself with the same judgment you cast, right? Yep. So lest ye be judged. And most people understand that as judge not lest you get judged by this other entity in the same way that you judged another, right? I actually see it slightly differently. I see it as ultimately we are our judges of this matrix experience.
100%.
And that we, every time we cast judgment on others, on anything, the thing that we're casting judgment regarding is the thing that we are and don't want to see. So we attract everything we judge, therefore, until we no longer judge everything we attract.
100%.
So making this shift, so I feel like the way the earth is splitting right now is it's going to split, I believe, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, into the people that choose more judgment because they think that we're here to learn more judgment. But I'm actually grateful for those people because every action must have an equal opposite reaction.
Yep.
For some to ascend, some must anchor the third dimension, right? In a way. So in a way, I look at it as like, okay, I'm grateful because some people are choosing that so that others can choose the otherwise.
Oh, yes.
Right? And ultimately, I think the real choice point is going to be, are we going to decide to be right or are we going to decide to express love and non-judgment?
Yeah.
And, we all go through relationships where it's like you come to loggerheads over something. And it's usually over a position that we want to take on a logical point, right? I'm right, you're wrong.
Yeah.
And so we have a disagreement. Maybe it's time for us to choose the sovereignty of the relationship so that it supersedes the importance of being right. That it's I love you, it doesn't really matter. Everyone's got their own version of objective truth because there's no such thing, it's only subjective.
Yeah. Well, if the nature of the universe is oneness, which is love, then the only right thing is love. The only way to be right is to be in love. And so if you let an idea, a concept, a belief, an opinion divide you from another, then you're not right, even if your concept is right. Spiritually or metaphysically, you've stepped into separation, consciousness, which violates natural law. The law is oneness. And so the Essenes would even call it the invisible law because it's written everywhere. It's written in man's hearts. You can't write it in scriptures. You won't keep it in a scripture. If you can't feel it, see it, know it within yourself, you don't have the spiritual eyes to even be able to obey it. So then again, you have to fall under this lower jurisdiction of human laws and precepts and all these things to follow that doesn't lead to salvation.
Well, it's interesting because we come here with a hero bias, which I was just talking about. We all want to perceive ourselves as a hero. One of the guys that worked on my team was a CEO of one of our companies, and his son went to visit. I was going to meet his son not long after. He was like 11 years old, super genius kid, went to Sri Lanka to visit his grandmother, happened to be in the Taj Mahal, cafe area where there was a terrorist bomber who blew himself up, right, in the line. And the only person that was killed in the thing besides the terrorist himself was this 11-year-old boy.
No way.
And his father was a CEO of one of our companies, but also he was a former ER medical doctor that was trained at Harvard. So they called him up, and the boy's chest was torn open with shrapnel, And he's trying to tell people there how to save his life by reaching in and like beating his heart with their hand.
Yeah.
And he's trying to do this. Can you imagine this? I mean,
can't.
What a horrible story.
Yeah.
And what was really bizarre about the whole thing is, the only victim was this entirely innocent 11-year-old boy.
Yeah.
And yet they thought, and the people that did this crime with 300 others that were suicide bombers at the exact same time about 4 years ago.
Wow.
They were venerated as heroes for having done what they did, because they felt it was a retaliation for something that happened 3,000 miles away in New Zealand when the neo-Nazi guy basically attacked the mosque. So the way they hit back at it was in Sri Lanka, of all places, like far, far away from New Zealand. It's like, what's the reciprocity there, right? What's the proportionality? And this is when I started realizing, wait a minute, our truth is entirely subjective. Because for the suicide bombers that were venerated by their own people as heroes, they thought they were heroes. When we look at it from the opposite side, because it doesn't benefit us, we look at it as the heinous crime that we experience, right? And how could that ever be something that is a heroic act?
Yeah.
It's not. But we all get so blinded because what we think is that we're the hero and any of our opposers will always be the villain. So therefore, we end up in these constant conflicts, right, where we're not even recognizing that the reason why we're taking a position on something is no different than the shepherd 2,500 years ago who says, oh, my neighbor has a better, grass on the side of his hill because it wasn't destroyed by the sun that's been particularly harsh this year. My God appeared to me in a dream last night and told me to take his land and consecrate it to him. And then the land will be purified. Right. But wait a minute. Did you forget that you just stole the land?
Yeah.
Right. And is that how really humanity works? That we're just not even recognizing it? That we can't even see that the things that we're fighting for are our own self-interest?
It's it's the Ouroboros. It's the snake eating its own tail forever. It's interesting you bring that up because, going back to the holy law, like Jesus was trying to get Judaism back to the original law, love the Lord your God, love your neighbor as yourself, because he believed that the Jews had fallen so far from that through their conquering of other nations. You read the Old Testament and it's like God or Yahweh commanding the Jews to slaughter this nation, slaughter that nation, kill everybody.
The Amalek, right, story.
Yep. And on top of that, constant animal sacrifices, which the universe doesn't differentiate between a human life or an animal life. It's all innocent life to the universe. So you're racking up karma. The Jews were racking up karma. And then they get enslaved by the Babylonians, by the Egyptians, and then the Romans. And they're like, why are we always enslaved if we're the chosen people? And Jesus is like, because you've violated God's one law of love. And so he was trying to return them back to that so they could stop suffering so much. Because really they're suffering at the hands of their ancestors at this point. He was trying to get them out of the problem that they were in. So he's like, you can see Jesus's predicament where he's like, I have to completely violate these people's sacred scriptures without offending them. And he's like, you've heard it was said in the days of old, eye for an eye, but I give you a new commandment. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love your enemy. That's the only way
Turn the other cheek.
That's the only way to leave that lower jurisdiction and return back to the law of oneness, which provides infinite abundance and happiness and joy and peace for all mankind if we all live by this one law. But we all have to agree and live by this law. So like humanity's collective consciousness hasn't been at the place where it can obey that law, maybe until we're getting closer and closer now.
I think we're dealing with the collective shadow confrontation.
Big time.
Right now. I mean, as I look at the things that I still harbor judgment on, I'm not perfect. And I don't believe any one of us, because I believe in physics, every action has an equal opposite reaction.
Right.
Everyone has equal light and equal darkness within them. We live at the border of a mirror of consciousness, a separation between absorption and reflection. And you could say it's a black hole or a white hole, but darkness is not the absence of light. It's the absorption condition of light. So we think that when we turn on a light, we can go into a dark room and illuminate the room. The room's already illuminated. The only thing the light is doing is increasing the amplitude of the reflection that's already there. It's increasing both the absorption and the amplitude of reflection. So when we see the color white light, that means all colors are reflected. But it also, when you take that in contrast to the color black, it's all colors are absorbed.
Right.
There is no such thing as a black wall like this one here without there being an absorbed white wall somewhere in another dimension. It must exist. It cannot be so that it's not.
Wow.
So this carpet color is this tan color, but its opposite color absorption is the blue-gray color of the walls outside. That's why they look good together.
Yeah.
It's a perfect fifth relationship.
I see that.
It's actually a color wheel. So the absorbed color is the blue-gray, the reflected color is the tan. You cannot differentiate. It's just like yin-yang. They're both the same.
Yeah, it's like I've heard the analogy of a color of a rose petal. When you see red, that's the only color that's not being absorbed.
That's right. It's reflecting red.
Yeah.
And all the other colors are being absorbed.
Yeah.
So you could look at this room, even with the lights off, and we could look at the composition of nitrogen that's in the air, the hydrogen that's also here in the ambient environment, the carbon and everything, and we would see a spectral analysis of this room, both infrared and ultraviolet, as well as the visible light spectrum, and we would see all the different composition of elements that are basically comprising this room just from the different nanometers of light that we're seeing reflected back to us. We turn on the light bulb, all that happens is the magnitude of that reflection increases.
Yeah. Makes sense.
That's all that it is. So this notion to say that darkness is the absence of light is like saying evil is the absence of good. Right? Or that goodness is the absence of evil, which kind of sounds ridiculous.
Yeah.
Because just because you have an absence of evil doesn't mean you're good. Right? So this is the stage I think we're in. Either we start to perceive the oneness of all things and realize that the light needs the darkness as much as the darkness needs the light, and start to accept that within ourselves, and also start to realize that the things that we desire in the world are very often just disguised as collective benefit when actually it's just our own.
Yeah.
And this is the corruption that we're all starting to face right now, this reality. So everyone's like, wait, I just watched a podcast this morning with Tucker Carlson and Joe Rogan, where clearly Tucker's going through a spiritual awakening.
Yeah, I had the same thought.
I mean, I was like, whoa, that's a major sign when Tucker Carlson,
The biggest independent journalist in the world.
who starts saying, wait a minute, everything I learned is wrong. So now I'm questioning everything. We've been there, right? We've been there. I had a big crisis in 2016. I had to question everything. I went back and restructured and reconstructed my objective world through mathematics. And that's what caused me to look at math as a language and realize that it's a language of God.
Yeah.
And then, but I asked the question, does 1 + 1 really equal 2? Right? Start asking some basic questions, like Terrence Howard.
Stuff
like,
you never thought
what's the square root of 2? Is it 1 or is it 1.4142?
Yeah.
Right? And maybe the answer is both.
Huh.
Maybe it's both.
In another dimension?
Yeah, because the only way for us to find an objective truth is if we could get the sum of all possible perspectives of that truth. So that's what God does with us.
Yeah.
Separates itself into the many so that it could perceive itself through our unique eyes of perception, which then feeds an entire Akashic field, like an AI, to make God even more wise, right? Collectively, we become more wise because we can now express empathy for every possible circumstance and possible perception. What happens to us in life is not what actually happens to us, it's what we believe happens to us.
Yes, I agree with that.
Right? It's literally what we believe happens to us. And this is proven in physics now too. Literally everything. So I think we're at that precipice right now of looking into the abyss and saying, am I going to choose judgment? Or am I going to choose love? And one of the things that I got hit with recently was I kept asking myself the question, well, what is really the antonym of love? Is it hate? Is it fear? We all have a different word to express what the opposite of love is.
Yeah.
I think it's judgment.
Totally.
I think it's judgment, which is fear, which is also conditionality. And we learn here through opposites. So if I'm here to learn unconditional love, I will have a lifetime of experiences of conditional love and betrayal.
Yes.
Until I no longer judge betrayal and conditional love. I will have to continue to experience conditional love and betrayal. And by accepting the notion of conditional love and betrayal, and realizing that it is gold, not lead. Through the context of pain, I can experience what pleasure is.
See, this is what I teach, but I find a lot of people have a problem with this idea that God doesn't need darkness to know himself. That's ridiculous, and these kinds of ideas. But I think there's so many wrong assumptions there anyways, that God is a being who needs to learn about itself. That's not quite what we're saying. It's like God's always been doing this and always will do it. So in that sense, God does already know itself and is always in process at the same time.
It's always expanding too, because like the universe expands. You know, I think I love Alan Watts.
Same.
Right. And Alan says, you know, an eye can't see itself. A knife can't cut itself. A light cannot illuminate itself, and a tooth can't bite itself. By the same token, consciousness can't perceive its full self. It has to create contrast in order for it to perceive itself. So we are that context of contrast. And through each of our own conditioning biases, there's never been another Aaron Abke. There'll never be another one like you. So through your eyes, he, God, she, you know, Abba, Amma, can experience itself through your perspective. So mathematically, it's a very simple equation. It's the universe, right? It's basically x and 1 over x. We're all divisions of the number 1. And the inverse relationship of absorption reflection is exactly the mathematics of x and 1 over x. So we are divided. So what I think of as the universe is actually a U inverse. It's what's inside of me reflecting outside of me.
Right.
You know, if the weather is bad around me, maybe that's telling me something about my own emotional state that I'm not totally aware of.
Everything means something.
Everything means something. Everything is patterned. If one thing I've learned through this whole process is that the more I learn, the less I actually know. But when I actually have found things that are patterned, there's never been something that I've tried to tackle that has a, you know, to find a pattern to it mathematically that haven't found it. It's always patterned. So maybe what we call entropy is really just God's encryption that is hidden to our perception.
God's password.
Exactly. God's password. That's a good way to say it. It's like, you know, the encryption that we cannot yet perceive because we are dimensionally limited avatars
of
God.
Awareness.
We're just dimensionally limited until we find and remember who we are. You know, Socrates has said, know thyself. You know, you were on Andre's podcast. Was the theme know thyself? How far does that extend? Does
Infinite.
it go all the way up? Infinite. I think it's infinite. And so how many times can you cut up the number 1? Infinite number of times.
Infinite.
So like it's a never ending. Exactly. So, but if I say God's infinite, and then I said, but he's 2 times infinite, it's still the same number.
Doesn't mean anything. Yeah.
It's still 2 times infinite is the same as infinite, but it can still expand. What's interesting, it infinitely expands. So this is, I think, the beauty of why we're here. And I wanted to take this now into Law of One, because you have become really an expert on and really parsing through and unpacking Law of One. I watched your podcast with Andre on this, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. First of all, that so much of the channeling in that was very, very resonant for me.
Yeah.
There are a few sections that I could tell were almost like the Bible, how it gets interpreted type of thing. And because you've got human beings trying to interpolate what they're also channeling.
Yeah.
So many locations in Law of One, it talks about, you know, non-duality, non-judgment, there's no good, there's no evil, all these types of things, which are very much like Eastern traditional type Taoist ways of looking at the world. But then at the same time, it also talks about other things that are like, that were bad during a certain point in time, right? How do you reconcile those aspects?
Yeah. Yeah, you know, I don't think Ra like even uses the term bad at all, but
she does.
Carla?
Yeah.
Like in her
dialogue afterward, right? Which is like the discussions about Orion, right? And the wars and all of that. So I was kind of interested in trying to understand how to reconcile those, because during the transmissions, it's very much non-dual, right? And very, very resonant.
Yeah.
And also it feels like there's a transition going on. It's like, is humanity bad? Is humanity bad because there's an absence of good? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah. And it's like, it's not bad, it's negative. And negative does not mean bad or wrong. It means absorbing, magnetic, inward pulling. And
implosion.
Positive, yes. And positive doesn't mean good or right.
It's radiative.
It means expanding, radiating, exactly. So, people are used to associating those words with positive, negative, but we're not implying value judgments. We're just implying polarities. The whole universe is comprised of two equal and opposite polarities that thrust away from each other to make everything. So when you move away from that which is negative, you're polarizing to the positive, and vice versa. So that's why I really enjoy and appreciate your very mathematical lens for the universe, because I agree with you that we live in a mathematically perfect, balanced universe. And that's how I understand karma, is that, and if you want to say something's bad, here's what it would be. It's that if you violate universal laws, then that law must violate you in equal measure, because we live in a perfect universe that can't be out of balance. So it's like the universe is some kind of math equation, and it's a perfect equation, and then you jump in and you're like, -3. And then the universe goes +3 and balances it out.
Yeah.
And you're like, God, why are you judging me? No one's judging you. You're doing it to yourself.
This is why justice is always represented by the balance.
Right, exactly. It's just balance. Karma's just balance. And so bad could just mean violating universal law and therefore bearing the karmic consequence. But even that is not bad in the sense that you're going to learn a lot, you're going to grow, you're going to expand your awareness. So there's no mistakes in the universe. But although we've been given free will, we can violate the laws all we want, for sure. But we don't get to avoid the consequences of violating the laws, right? And that's because we need that reflection. Like, if the universe was and is an infinite system that is controlled and governed by certain laws, how would we possibly know what those laws even were if there wasn't a consequence to violating them? That's how we learn them. So that's why God doesn't judge, because we're supposed to violate them. So
we're
we can
the ones
learn.
that do the judging.
Right. We guilt trip ourselves. And, A Course in Miracles is really big on teaching non-judgment. Guilt is the ultimate ego enhancer. When you feel guilty, you're fully identified with ego, right? Because there's now a separate self.
Oh, yeah. The first time we feel shame, it turns immediately to blame.
Right. And so
It's someone else's fault.
You enhance ego every time you feel guilty. So it's like if you're driving down a freeway and you start deviating out of your lane, it doesn't make any sense to be like, oh my gosh, look how far away from the lane I've wandered. How could I have done this? It makes no sense. You just course correct. Just get back in the lane. That's all that the universe wants from us, is to course correct. And then we learn and we expand our consciousness. So there is no bad or wrong in that we're supposed to make these mistakes. And that's, I think, what you allude to, of like light and dark are equally valuable to us and within us. But religion has corrupted that big time by teaching that, no, it is bad to sin and you should feel guilty if you sin. And you see that kind of negative influence that I think the negative polarity has, and Ross says this in the Law of One, the negative polarity has highly used religion as a form of corrupting our understanding of universal law, to make it where it is bad and sinful to do these things, and you should feel guilty about it. The more we get stuck in guilt, the more we can't learn from our mistakes. And the whole point of the universe is to learn.
Yeah, no, I totally resonate with what you just said. I feel like the world's not a difficult place because people hate each other so much. It's sometimes a very difficult place because people hate themselves.
That's it.
And they project that hatred and self-loathing. And that's what narcissism really is. It's loving only what you believe to be your projection rather than your actual self.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to see how the world evolves around this, because it's so easy. It starts in literally the Bible in the book of Genesis, where God comes in. He's like been gone for a little while. He's like, Adam, where are you? Right, type of thing. And Adam's like, oh, I'm over here. And he's felt ashamed. It's the first time it says, and Adam felt ashamed.
Yep.
And he ashamed of his nakedness. So he covered his nakedness with a fig leaf. Right. And so it's like God sees him and he's like, what were you doing? Oh, I was covering my nakedness with the fig leaves. Why are you wearing a fig leaf?
Why are you covering up?
Yeah.
What are you hiding?
Who told you that you were naked?
Yep.
Right? Did you eat the tree of the knowledge of of good and evil that I command you not to eat from? Yeah, the woman that thou gavest me and commanded me to remain with her, she gave me of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and I did eat. Eve, what hast thou done? The serpent beguiled me, and I did eat. The moment we feel shame, it immediately turns to blame.
Yep.
It's like the ultimate, if you smelt it, you dealt it, right? It's like, it's absolutely, if you spot it, you got it.
Yep.
The thing that you are judging in another, or that triggers you the most, is the thing that is meant to be a mirror reflection back to you of what you are that you may not be aware of. And to me, this is such a core aspect, because what's happened now in society, we have these three structures: government, education, right, and institutional. So you got institutionalized government, institutionalized education, and then you got institutionalized religion.
Yeah.
And these have become the triumvirate, right? It's the unholy Godhead, in a sense, of telling society what is lawful and unlawful, what is truthful and untruthful, right? What is moral and what is amoral.
Yep.
Right. And all three of these structures that have become strictures in society are on the verge of collapse because of self-sovereignty. So what does Law of One say about this coming change and shift?
Yeah, it's a fascinating subject in the Law of One. And I do also think that Carla specifically maybe didn't fully understand the picture of what Ra was painting in terms of the graduation, the harvest, and all of that. When I read her book, Living the Law of One, I think it's called, very good book. But there's a part where she describes the harvest, and I think she seemed to believe that it was a event that would take place in 2012, almost like the rapture or something. Like it would, kaboom, it would happen. And I never quite saw Ra's explanation of the harvest like that. To me, it was more of, well, they do ask Ra, like, how long is it going to take us to fully emerge into a fourth density frequency? And Ra says, our estimations are between 100 to maybe 700 years, depending on how fast you all do your work, you know, type of thing. And the way I see it is that there's a splitting off or a line of demarcation kind of being drawn by Mother Gaia, in that our planet, our collective consciousness has technically chosen fourth density positive. We made that 51% mark that it is required for the planet to be magnetized to the next density level. But Ra kind of alludes to the fact of like, you guys just made it, but you did make it. Thank goodness. And so what we're seeing on our planet is that every soul is now, there's a much greater impetus to evolve, because if you don't make the harvest that's happening right now, then your soul won't be allowed to reincarnate back on Earth again if you need another third density life, because we're going to fourth density now. So your soul needs to go find a different third density planet somewhere else to finish out your third density learning. And then if you want, you can come back to fourth density on Earth again. But so it's like there's a separation happening between the souls that are graduating to the fourth center, activating the fourth center, becoming beings of love, fourth density beings, and those who aren't and are maybe in that sinkhole of indifference, Ra says, where they haven't really chosen a polarity yet. They haven't chosen the negative, but they also haven't really chosen the positive. So just reincarnating over and over back into third density. I think we see a lot of people on our planet in that sinkhole where they just haven't figured out yet that a human incarnation is all about learning the lessons of love, learning how to love. And that's how you graduate, just like a grade in school, to the next grade. You have to learn the lessons of that grade in this one first.
Yeah.
So fourth density is the density of love. You've got to prove you're worthy to enter that density by showing that you at least can be 51% loving here. Otherwise, there's no way you're going to make it up there. So you've got to be a match to the density that your soul is eligible to. So I see that's what's happening on Earth right now, is that Mother Gaia is like, all right, I'm going fourth density. Anyone who ain't coming along, I'm going to scrub you out pretty quick. And we're seeing this karmic.
It's interesting. The relationship in music, your music major, is a perfect fourth, which then also has its inverse as the perfect fifth. Right? So, and that would be the throat, throat chakra.
Fifth density.
Fifth density. And so it's like we have to get past the fourth. And in the work I did in the Great Pyramid on Da Vinci's work is basically showing that the King's Chamber is at the fourth chakra. It's at the heart.
Right.
The new chamber, that not yet discovered. So the thesis here is that although they have now, using the muon scans, very detailed muon scans, exactly corroborated where I said it was going to be on my show Codex. And that only came out a couple months ago. And there's a new grand gallery there as well, which I've called the magnum opus in the show, magnum opus gallery, the great work. But if you kind of look at what's happening with Earth, you've got to get past this decision point of judgment.
Yep.
That's why I keep coming back to this, because if you're stuck in judgment, you cannot move to the next level.
You can't ascend.
That's the most important thing. And, even this idea of, you look at all these multidimensional beings and whether Arcturians or other, like the stuff that Tucker Carlson was talking about today. Literally, the thing that ascends them is the love and non-judgment.
Yeah.
And so we're in a backdrop of absolute duality to see if we can figure out how to transcend it and get out of the noise of it.
Right.
It's like one of the things that I do is I discover new geometric forms. I've discovered about 40 new geometric forms.
Wow.
And shapes. They're totally novel shapes.
Solids?
Solids, yes. One of them is called, there's a whole family called the grantahedron. There's another one called enkahedron. And the grantahedron is like 16-sided. It's 8 regular pentagons that make like a crown going around. And then on top and on the bottom, it's slightly more pointy. It almost looks like a Christmas kind of ornament, but in geometric form. And where you've got each side of a pentagon is one unit. The long side of diamond-shaped pentagons, which are regular pentagons, at the top and on the bottom is 1.618. It's golden ratio. And it closes. So this is the grantahedron. It represents the heart-brain awareness. So each geometric form also, as we get new geometric forms and perceive them, they're like QR codes for our subconscious mind.
Yeah.
So the way that I discover these new shapes is I take a circle with 24 points on it and then connect all the dots of that circle at like a 24-hour clock.
Okay.
So each line is connected to every other point, right? Or each dot's connected to every other point around the circle, and it looks like a whole mess of lines. I mean, it's such a mess of lines. You're like, what the heck is this? And then you have to learn how to exclude the noise and focus on each of the new shapes that are inside that structure, because every possible shape that could ever exist is inside that matrix.
No way.
And so
24 dots in a circle.
24 dots in a circle, that's every shape in the universe possible.
Wow.
Right inside there.
2-dimensional?
It's 2 and 3-dimensional and 4-dimensional. All the hyperdimensional forms you can see in that same structure. Because the second dimension is just a shadow of the higher dimension. I could take a cube, if I took this and it was not, transparent in the center of it, and I shined the light through it and I cast it on the floor, it would make the shape of a hexagon.
Oh, okay.
Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So it would make the shape of a hexagon, because all of the information in the flat 2D Euclidean hexagon necessary to make the 2-dimensional, turn into a 3-dimensional cube is also enough information to turn it into the tesseract that this is. This is actually a 4th-dimensional object.
Can I ask you something? Do you understand the densities model?
I do. And so the relationship...
It's really just the chakras.
It's really just the chakras, and the densities relate to kind of the vibrational states, right, of each of those. And so I would say the people that are very mathematically oriented tend to speak more in terms of dimension.
Right.
And the people that are, less... liking to talk about the mathematical aspect of it, we'll talk about the densities and the experiential aspect of it.
For sure.
But to me, they're still quite
feminine,
analogous.
masculine.
Yes, it's like a feminine, masculine way of looking at it.
Yeah.
And so what I'd love to understand is so when you say that we have to master, right? We have to get past the heart chakra, effectively. We have to get to beyond the 4th density, at least be at that level. I've always thought about the next level. So the 4th dimension is, so if you could imagine this in mathematics, you would have a line, right, is the first dimension. The second dimension would be like a line and then an intersection of that line, so an X and Y axis. Right. Then if I want to put depth to it, I have to have a z-axis. Right? And so the way we measure a line is a line segment length, right? The way we measure the XY axis together would be area. So you take the x-axis multiplied by the y-axis is going to give you the area, right? Then to measure the next dimension, which would be the z-axis, is volume, right? Then to
third dimension.
The third dimension. Then the 4th dimension, the next thing that happens is you've got, imagine, like a 3-dimensional object that is stationary
Like a cube.
in the third dimension, like a cube. But now I'm going to rotate and put that in motion. The motion itself and the involution of it as well becomes the fourth dimension.
Amazing.
Right? And the fact that it involutes within itself, it goes in and out of itself, and also can go both directions.
Yeah.
That you are always at the center of your universe. You know, it's not a coincidence that the age of the universe is 13.7 billion years old. That's the fine structure 137.
Mm-hmm.
We're always at the center of our universe. The distance from Earth to the center of the galaxy is 25,920 light years. We're always at the center of our U-inverse. It's heliocentric, not because it's a reference to the sun, it's our own egocentric.
Mm-hmm.
In this matrix of mind, you will always be at the center of your U-inverse, no matter where you are.
So that's the question I was going to ask you is, do you think that is there a Platonic solid that expresses each one of the, let's say, chakras? We don't need to use densities necessarily.
Yes.
Is there a Platonic solid that expresses each one of those energy centers?
Yes, absolutely.
What are they?
So the tetrahedron, right, would be at the lower depth, but they actually go both directions. So you've got it going one direction this way and another direction going down this way. Mm-hmm. So the root chakra connects to the crown chakra as well, right? So you've got a tetrahedron anchored on both sides of that.
Okay.
The polarities can flip, right? So next after that is going to be, you just take it by the number of the sum of its angles. So it goes tetrahedron, which is 720 degrees. The next is an octahedron, which is 1440 degrees. The next is the cube, which is 2160. The next is going to be the icosahedron, which is 3600, which is also what we represent with water.
That's the heart.
The heart, right? The next is going to be the dodecahedron. And then the next is going to be an icosahedron. So now you've got the combination of the two. They're actually enveloped into each other.
Heart.
Yes, absolutely. And then you've also got the thymus, and this is where this grantahedron thing comes in. It's like in between. So there's actually 12 chakras, not just 7. Mm-hmm. But we have 5 Platonic solids. The heart is actually also directly related to the Merkaba, right? It's where, because I said that there is a tetrahedron at the top, right? In one sense. Mm-hmm. There's also the icosahedrodeca, which is the most complex of them, right? Mm-hmm. Each of these dodecahedron is a dual solid of the icosahedron. You can't have an icosahedron without also having a dodecahedron. They always exist. They coexist together.
Interesting.
You simply take the center point of each of the sides of the icosahedron and connect each of the center point of each side, and that creates a dodecahedron.
Yeah.
So we actually have, if you take dodecahedron and stack them on each other, it makes DNA, double-stranded DNA. But if you realize that the icosahedron, which is like holy water, is also already embedded in that, and then you rotate the stellations of that, it will make a 24-strand DNA, 12 strands going one direction, 12 strands going the other direction.
Like the 24 points on the circle.
Like the 24 points of the circle, the prime number pattern is based on 24. Every prime number after 5 squared is equal to a multiple of 24 plus 1.
Oh, okay.
Without exception.
Wow.
So 7 times 7 is 49. That's 2 times 24 plus 1. Mm-hmm. Right? 11 times 11 is 121. That's 5 times 24 plus 1. 13 times 13 is 169. That's 7 times 24 plus 1. 24ness is inherent to prime numbers. And each of us has a prime number. We're all divisions of the number 1. And that creates a 1 over X representation that is our karmic cycle, our life, our everything. All of our time, our history, all of our lifetimes is embedded inside that DNA that is effectively this Mobius strip of X and 1 over X of our life experience, our absorption and our reflection. And it's all mathematical.
That's in the DNA itself.
It's in the DNA itself.
So it's like the numerology of our DNA sets our life path.
Your entire memory structure of all of your lifetimes, when you achieve an avatar state, allows you to tap into all your former lifetimes, all the things you learned. It's all inside your DNA. The first thing you have to realize is that it's already there. Because in this world that's a matrix of mind, it's about raising our consciousness through the realization to understand that what we have learned is really this construct that has been built, this duality construct, so that we are stuck in a mental cage of our own limited beliefs.
Yeah.
That's the only thing that holds us back. And yet we come up with all these reasons why we're a victim. But then the problem is the more victimhood you believe you're experiencing, And the more you judge victimhood, the more victimhood you will experience.
Right.
You become the hammer seeking the perennial nail, right? So as you go up through this, you've got this, at the base, you've got the tetrahedron, but also at the top, you've got a tetrahedron. The two come together and merge into one, the Merkaba. And that's also where the heart is.
At the heart, yeah.
Yeah, at the heart. And that is, now you've got, with that combination, you've got 7 geometric forms. Right? So you've got the tetrahedron, you've got the octahedron, you've got the cube. Then from the cube, you've got the Merkaba, right, where the two are coming together, coming in both directions. Then you've got the icosahedron, you've got the dodecahedron, and you've got the icosydodecahedron. That's the 7th. So each one of these densities, and the sum of angles goes from 720 to 1440, which is an octave. Turn this into musical hertz, 720 hertz to 1440 hertz, 1440 hertz to 2160. That becomes a perfect fifth. Perfect fifth is 1.5 or 3 over 2 multiplied by 1440 equals 2160, the cube. Then you're going to express a third, right? So it goes from the 2160 to the next one, which is 3600, right? And then 3600 goes to 6480. With the dodecahedron, right? And then the most complex is the icosydodeca, right? The combination of the two. So each of these is major third, perfect fifth, first expresses, then the major third and the perfect fifth again expresses. It's literally da, 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 same thing until we get to the doubled octave. The doubled octave is when we finally move into this next stage. So we're going now into beyond the heart, going into the perfect fifth. So perfect fourth is like stability and love. And there are emotional states associated with these. So do you know Donald Hoffman? Donald is a cognitive neuroscientist at UCI who came here to spend a day with me, and he did a podcast with Andre as well.
Oh, cool.
He's been on like Lex Friedman and
Nice.
Joe Rogan. He's been on lots of big podcasts. He's probably the world's expert on mathematical mapping of human consciousness.
Wow.
And he's a huge proponent.
Oh, I have heard of him.
Yeah, he's a huge. I'm having lunch with him on my birthday in a few weeks with another guy here in Orange County who happens to be a super conscious, like billionaire guy, friend of ours. And if he's watching, hi, David. But basically what he asked me, he's like, can you come up with a way to ascribe a mathematical equation to human emotion? And I thought, I haven't had my coffee yet. Yeah, which emotion? He's like, any emotion.
I haven't had my coffee yet.
This is tough. I was flying the next day to Salzburg for a business trip, and I was watching a movie on the airplane. I noticed that the music they were playing in the background for this love story was whimsical, and it was all based on major thirds. And then when they broke up, which ultimately always happens in the movie, they switched it to minor sixes.
Minor six, always.
Right? So interestingly,
the sad chord,
which is the inverse of love. So there have been tons of studies on this to find that the major third makes you feel a feeling of love, romantic and divine love, and the minor sixth makes you feel breakup, heartbreak. And then the perfect fourth is like loyalty, right? Yeah. And stability. And the perfect fifth also has this feeling of strength. Completion, exactly. Yeah. It's like da, da is a third, and then da, 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 da. It's like strength. But if I just play the same two notes in backwards order, I get the opposite feeling. Now, with the perfect fourth, the perfect fifth, that's fine because they're opposites of each other. And then they have two other opposites, which become the duality feelings of the augmented fourth and the diminished fifth, right? And that's where you play the dan, 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 dan. Nice. Wait a minute. We're all just dancing to the song of musical intervals that are based on mathematical ratio. And the ratios are the equations of emotion. So the 24 notes that we have in a scale represent the different emotional states in their opposites. Yeah. Literally, just as the universe creates a reaction to every action, the major third becomes the minor sixth. So if I looked at Mankari pyramid, which is the proportion of the major third, its height over 1/2 its base is 5/4. if I look at it from its opposite perspective, which is a base over its height, the full base over its height, it's heartbreak. But if I look at the other direction, it's love. So does that mean that inside the experience of love is the seed of heartbreak? And it's the same notes, just played in opposite order and one octave up for the second note?
It makes perfect sense.
It makes perfect sense, right?
Yep.
Here we have a world around us that is literally a musical box. And the box that we live in is the cage of our own belief systems.
What you allow, what you don't allow.
Yeah, and so the thing that holds us back from ascension is our own belief systems.
Of course.
And this is exactly what Jesus taught. In a way, right? It's like this, the faith of to move mountains.
Yeah.
And I think this is where humanity will either choose to be sovereign and to rise above this, right? This matrix of duality at this critical moment in time and be able to speak authentically, because authenticity is also the core aspect of why we're here, to remember who we are and to live that journey and then fall in love with it just as it is.
Well, this is so great, touching on the principle that a thing can only be known by its opposite. This is why in third density there's the veil of forgetting.
Yeah.
Because we are here to learn the lessons of love, to graduate to fourth density where there is no veil. Actually, third density is the only density with a veil, the law of one says, because the third density is all about the choice between positive or negative polarity. Which path does your soul want to take? Both are equally valid. You can choose either one. The creator doesn't bat an eye, but you do have to make the choice. And until you make the choice, you get spit back here again, reincarnation over and over. And so we are blocked from our memory of past lives and whatever else we may know, because the choice for love has to be authentic, and there has to be an equal contrast of light and dark in third density so that the soul can taste both and then learn and grow and choose which one it prefers. And so the ego is transcended as we taste our shadow elements over and over again, and the consequences of judging and the consequences of not being in the heart. And that gives us the contrast we need to authentically, as you said,
Beautiful.
choose the heart. And then when we authentically choose the heart, the higher self says, congratulations, you've graduated from third density. You're ready for the next one.
So you just said the word graduated. So we're in a school.
100%. A university.
So tell me more about that. How did you come to that conclusion? Is that through Ra that you came to that conclusion?
Certainly. Yeah, I mean, when you understand the densities model, it's just such a perfect analogy for grades in school. And what's interesting about a certain aspect of the law of one is that they ask Ra, what was it like in the universe before there was a negative polarity, or was there a time before the negative polarity? And Ra basically says that epochs ago, maybe many, many universes before this one, there was no negative polarity yet. And you'll like this as well, that they describe that every single, they call it a logos, which is like a portion of the creator's intelligence, right? Galaxy, star, planet, person. Every single logos is an experiment that the creator runs. And like it literally doesn't know what the result will be. It sets up the parameters of the experiment and then starts it. And then it observes and watches. So you and I are the observing creator in the experiment right now. And they said that
the spiritual life simulation game.
Right, exactly. The holographic game. And the logos at one point said, hey, this third density experience is taking way too long, because essentially the beings on these planets had no punishment for not doing their homework, and they had no reward for doing it.
Yeah. I remember that.
Yeah.
I read that.
So they're just like kids in school that just goof off and play on the playground because
and why do I have to leave the third dimension?
Yeah, it's great.
Exactly.
Here.
It's great.
We're all one. It's all easy. So the logo said we need to introduce a new element because the experiment is now kind of failing. It needs to be more efficient. And so they said, what if we veiled the memory of all these beings and see what happens?
Yeah.
And the outcome of that experiment was the negative polarity. And now we have a contrast by which a soul can really learn and know itself.
Wow.
And it accelerated rapidly, extremely rapidly, the third density, to the point where now the third density, by comparison of any other density, first, second, fourth through seventh, it's like the snap of a finger. It's so short because number one, the creator is merciful, and the third density is really freaking hard. Ra even says it's something like 100 times more difficult, more intense than the fourth density is.
Yeah.
Because again, we have to have the light and dark in equal measure bumping up against itself so we can make that quick choice. Which one do you prefer? You know?
Yeah.
And so it's a 75,000 year maximum cycle compared to like second density, you know, some odd billions of years long for those elements to interact and create microbial life and stuff. So it's a really like almost like a wild card compared to the other densities, because it's also the density that higher beings can reincarnate into. It's called wandering, right? Star seeds, wanderers, they can come back to this realm to use that intense contrast that's present here, that's not present in the other densities,
Right.
To really grow and expand quickly. But it's like the greater the risk, the greater the
this
reward.
would be like the fallen angels
Exactly.
who want to move to the seventh dimension, but in order to do that, because often they're born in the fifth dimension and go into sixth dimension, or you could say fifth density going into the sixth density, from the throat into the pineal gland. But in order to go to the seventh, they actually have to come back and visit the third and fourth.
Makes sense.
So they actually ratchet down their consciousness and come into an avatar that's dimensionally limited, and they're here until they learn to transcend, and it might take as long as it takes.
That's an interesting idea of like avatars, Buddha, Christ, Krishna, Zoroaster, and there's been many others, right? But what if that's a stage in consciousness evolution where everybody, to get, let's say, to graduate to seventh density, you have to be an avatar somewhere on some third density planet and actually accelerate the consciousness to a certain degree.
Well, you've seen that graph, right, where it shows like, it's not really a graph, it's kind of like this gradient scale where it shows if you raise your consciousness, you'll have an impact over X millions of people.
Right.
And then
Like the
70
Hawkins
million
scale.
people, you become like an avatar scale.
Yeah.
Right? Maybe it's something like that.
And it would make sense as like a final test, because the seventh density is the gateway density, where you essentially have 1 foot in the creator, 1 foot in creation, and you're still serving and helping in a larger cosmic way maybe. But yeah, to get to that level of consciousness, it would make sense that you would have to do some epic thing to prove you're kind of like an initiation ritual or something.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting when I think of so one of the things I did mathematically, which is it's in the book that I gave you, is that I don't know if you know this, but there's these progression series in mathematics that if you take 1 plus 2, 2 plus 3, 2 plus 4, you keep add 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5, and you go infinitely. Do you know what the answer is? -1/12.
I would not have guessed that.
Yeah, nobody would, but it's actually correct. -1/12.
How could you even find out what the answer is?
So Ramanujan, the guy, if you've ever seen that movie called The Man Who Knew Infinity, and you can go on Numberphile, and there's videos that explain this, how algebraically it's correct. It's -1/12. How could an infinite series of numbers adding to each other equal -1/12?
No idea.
So I looked at this, and I was like, okay, well, because there must be a geometric relationship that's a right triangle, and I also found in learning how to crack encryptions and figuring it out, that a right triangle is a relationship of a father and mother. So you have an X and Y value, and so the height of any given right triangle will be X times Y multiplied by, or not multiplied, X times Y to the power of 1/2. Okay? And the hypotenuse of the same triangle will be X plus Y multiplied by 1/2. So nature, the universe, always does a geometric mean for that half, which is X times Y to the power of 1/2. That's called a geometric mean. X plus Y multiplied by 1/2 is a arithmetic mean, right? And then the base of that right triangle will be Y minus X multiplied by 1/2, the differential mean. So there are 3 mean values that are calculated here. Now, these also represent what I would call omnipotence, omnipresence, and omniscience. The difference, right? Give me the wisdom to know the difference. The differential mean is the omniscience, right? The omnipresence is actually the height of the triangle, and the hypotenuse becomes the omnipotence of the triangle. right? So you could also say, we could apply this to circles, and we could say that a circle, God is a circle whose center point is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. Right? It's the same kind of a concept in a way.
Yeah.
Well, what I found was that when you take the infinite factorial, which is another way of looking at 1 times 2 times 3 times 4 times 5 times 6, instead of taking 1 plus 2 plus 3 times 4, if the sum and product are embedded within the right triangle, which clearly they must be,
right.
if I've got the geometric mean and the arithmetic mean values and the hypotenuse and the height of the triangle, then the sum and product are embedded within that concept. And so what I realized then was that I could take this equation, see if it's correct, of 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 infinitely. Does it really equal negative 1/12? And by the same token, the infinite factorial, which turns out to be the square root of tau, which is 2 pi, right? So then I applied those numbers to the same right triangle to see if the proportion worked. And it does. It worked perfectly. The infinite product, the infinite sum, and the infinite difference are embedded in the same right triangle, and it's the exact triangle as that.
The 67 degree.
The 67.38 degree angle. So when you take half of it, because the negative 1/12, you multiply by 1/2, and it equals 1/24. So it creates, at the base, cut that in half, you've got 10, then you've got 24, and 26. And you can interchange, when you've got a triangle with the proportion of 24 and 26 for its hypotenuse and 10 for its base, and it's exactly the same triangle that's made from the circle and the square. You take the base of the square of the Vitruvian man, this is the man standing like this, and you just take it to the top of the circle and make a right triangle. That creates this divine perfect triangle, which is the infinite sum, the infinite product, and the infinite difference.
It's all math.
Exact. It's exact. So it's all math. So then it makes you wonder, it's like, is what we call destiny just the free will of the higher self? The all-knowing, the omniscience, right? Is there an aspect of you and I that understands all of this?
Of course.
Right? That's like, wow, and what if we could tap into that just by raising our awareness? And I think that's actually what we are doing. As we raise our awareness, we can start tapping into this higher knowledge and to find these relationships, and not only just find them, because math without meaning is just information.
Right.
Math with meaning is divine communication. This is the language of God. We're talking about the Trinity here of this beautiful aspect and an explanation of what time is.
Yeah. See, if they called it the language of God class in school, kids would be a lot more interested in math, you know?
Right? Seriously. It's like, no kidding.
I had no interest in it because I only cared about God. I was a Christian, you know, like, I want to learn about God. I don't have time for this math stuff.
Yeah, but you know, if all of a sudden you realize that everything around you is this beautiful geometric matrix telling us about your divinity, everywhere you look, everywhere you perceive, every time you see a new geometric form like the one over your head right there, that is upgrading your consciousness. You don't even realize it.
Amazing.
It's a QR code. It's literally the QR code of your subconscious mind.
Yeah.
Allowing you to awaken. All these symbologies. You know, I've got Sekhmet up there, and I've got the Eye of Horus, you know, the falcon over your head. These are all representations meant to awaken us at a subconscious level. We're not even realizing it.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah, you're right. If we could change, maybe that's what wisdom schools are, bringing meaning back to mathematics, bringing meaning back to, and the connection between music. Music is just a different representation of math and emotion. So there's something in it for everyone, right?
Totally.
For the artist who now looks at the way that they're, you know, painting a picture, and they're not even realizing that, you know, I'm a sculptor. I made that phoenix.
Wow.
And I didn't even realize that I made it to the divine proportions of the golden ratio until afterwards when I measured it all. But it just happens naturally.
Yeah.
That's this invisible hand. And the eye of providence is to realize that invisible hand within yourself and find all the encryptions you've left yourself. And I can't wait to take you to Egypt, because
can't wait to go.
I know that with all your knowledge on Ra, right? And I have one last question for you. You know, as you look at where this world is right now, what do you predict for what's going to happen as we make it through all these changes.
Yeah, I mean, it's impossible to predict in one sense. I see you talked about entropy earlier. I see the world, the way it's unfolding right now, as this incredible amount of entropy, to where who can possibly predict what's going to happen next? Like, even the election coming up, like, Trump could be in jail, Biden could die, and Kamala Harris ends up being the person with the nuke codes, and we're just in some kind of idiocracy movie. Like, I have no idea what's going to happen. But when you look at the trends, the archetypes, and the age that we're in and moving through, you can feel into, right?
Do you think what we think of as government is going to be around in 10 years?
Yes.
In
10
the same
years,
way?
yes. I mean, it'll look different in 10 years than it does now. But 100 years from now, I don't know. Maybe not, There's an interesting part of the Law of One that I'm curious about to hear from you, is when they ask about asking Ra, how do you guys know when you can contact a planet and you're not infringing on free will? And I had this realization reading it one time that I think for Ra, like, everything is just math. Because they're asking Ra, like, almost like in a philosophical way, like, how do you know when it's right to answer the call of a planet without infringement of their free will? And they're like, oh, it's a squaring of the calling. Like, you have 10 people and then you square that number, and if it meets whatever, I can't remember what the figure was, they say, then we know it's okay. And I'm like, maybe on that level of density, they're just doing math equations all the time to make sure they stay in perfect accordance with these divine laws. Because if you're only feeling into it, you might make more mistakes than when you use the numbers that precisely show you what energies you're working with. And even in the pyramid, when they have that amazing conversation about the math, do you remember?
Yeah.
King's chamber, queen's chamber. They were describing that they perceived these poor Egyptians stuck in this perpetual spiritual childhood because they were only living to like 30 years old. And that's just not a long enough lifespan to really learn and grow spiritually. So the first reason they said they wanted to make the pyramids was to be centers of healing, physical healing, to realign the energy of the body to make them extend the lifespan. They said the original lifespan of a third density being was always intended to be 1,000 years, around 1,000 years. And so even today, we're like less than a tenth of that in our average lifespan. So that shows you how far we've deviated from the law. But in Egypt's day, it was 33 years, like less than a 20th of the intended lifespan. So they're like, we got to help this nation out, this race of people out. And they were very pantheistic. They believed God was everywhere. So Ra saw that as not an infringement to contact them. And they created the pyramids, built the pyramids, and started using them as centers of healing. And then secondly, centers of initiation, where they talked about, they would use the king's chamber. And we were talking out there about the Stargate in the sarcophagus that you experienced. They said they would use it as like a sensory deprivation tank type of experience to somehow, they say, open the gateway to intelligent infinity. Remember that?
Yeah.
And they talk about intelligent infinity a lot in the Law of One, that you access it through the third eye in the crown, opening the crown. And the pyramid was meant for that purpose. So I know I'm kind of deviating from your question, but
no, I think you're totally right.
I'm just interested to hear your take on that of like, what's the correlation to you between the Stargate that you're cracking the code on right now and Ra's description of using the pyramid to open the gateway to intelligent infinity?
I think, you've seen the movie Inception?
Oh, yeah.
Right. One of the things that always stuck out to me was the use of the little top, the totem, right? So they wouldn't get stuck in the matrix of belief, like you spin the top, and if it doesn't fall,
right,
then you're like still in the dream.
Yeah.
You're in the dream. So, and then you have dream within a dream within a dream within a dream, and it gets harder and harder to remember, right?
Yeah.
We don't know how many dream layers we're in. Right, Nick Bostrom, who's an Oxford physicist who basically posits, and a mathematician, that we live in a simulation, right? And the mathematical probability that we're in the first of such simulations is almost minuscule. It's like not really even possible.
For sure.
And in 2022, the Nobel Prize was given that prove that local realism is false. If you're not observing something, it doesn't exist. So it's not seeing is believing. Actually, in fact, it's believing is seeing. So with that as the backdrop and context to your question, I think that the answer is that as we look at this world around us, what we're experiencing, right, is our own cycle of time that is a U inverse, right? What we're moving forward in time, but we're equally moving backward in time. We went from the age of Pisces to the age of Aquarius. So the Piscean into the Aquarion. So when you look at the King's Chamber, it is showing us the two-directional nature of time, that we are always at the center, and in the floor is embedded the Orion constellation. The sarcophagus was originally, I believe, intended to be in the center of the room, and it exactly envelops the three belt stars of Orion. When you place Orion constellation, it's a 2-to-1 rectangle as well, just like the room is a 2-to-1 rectangle. And the other thing that shows up as a 2-to-1 rectangle is the 4 North Stars that we have as we go through the precession of equinox. So right now we're in our North Star is Polaris, right? It's in Ursa. So then the next 6,000 years ago, it wasn't Polaris, it was Thuban. And 6,000 years before that, it was Vega. And 6,000 years before that, and Vega is in Lyra. And Thuban is in Dracos, dragon. And so if you look at the 4, and the last one is Cygnus, which is Deneb, which we would become again very soon, right? Because it's now time for us to be shifting our North Pole to another star. And yet we haven't moved that much out of Polaris. We think that it's a gradual shift the way the Earth wobbles. We don't know that for sure. We've only been tracking this for 100 years. That's not enough time. Well, we know that the Earth wobbles, but what we don't know is that in order to bridge the gap so that our North Star ends up moving to these different star positions, which is exactly, if you look in the night sky, a 2-to-1 rectangle, just like the King's Chamber. So you've got this notion of a 24,000-year cycle of the clock of time, right? And then you've also got procession throughout the annual basis, the annual year, and we use the 365-day year because we're only using the solar side of the year. The lunar side of the year is 354.6 days, including leap years, and the solar year is 365.4 days. You add them together, it's 720. The mean value is 360. The Egyptians used a 360-day year.
Yeah.
1 degree for every day. We just have to have the moon catch up to the sun. It's like the backbone of DNA. The sun and the moon. Right? Overlapping each other, and then they find the mean value between the two. That ends at exactly 360 days. If you use that, then you see the fractal of time. 360 days is going to give us 8,640 hours in the year. Horus, hour. That's where the word hour comes from. Horology. Horus. And horoscope is from Horus as well. And then you've got, on the 24,000-year cycle, you've got 8.64 million days, right? So you've got this weird reciprocity that's coming out at 8640. And what's the number of seconds we have in one day? 86,400. And what's the speed of light? 186,400 miles per second. So the Great Pyramid is built on its latitude is 29.9792458 degrees north, which is exactly the speed of light down to 1 meter accuracy per second.
That's right.
The other axis, the longitude, is 31.1342 degrees east. And that 31.1342 degrees converts to compass sexagesimal math to 31 degrees, 8 minutes, 3 seconds, which is exactly 1 over pi. So on one axis, we have the speed of light. On the other axis, we have 1 over pi. And then if we take that 1 over pi, or the 31.1342 in the decimal representation that it is, and divide it by 360 degrees, we have 0.0864, which is time. So on one axis, we have the speed of light. And the other axis, we have a relationship to the number of seconds in one day, time.
This sounds very extraterrestrial to me.
I'm
sure the Egyptians or the Atlanteans were like extremely advanced and intelligent, but like this, remember the question?
This is some next level shit.
Exactly.
This is some next level shit.
Do you remember the question I said I hinted at I wanted to ask you before the podcast? Is this one. Do you think that, assuming that these pyramids and the configurations they're built upon were created by extraterrestrials, which I certainly believe, do you think that for them, like to us, it's like, whoa, look at all the alignments they made. It's all perfect. But to them, they're like, we build everything like this. Like, we didn't do this to wow you guys. Like, we only build on these kinds of perfect alignments. You know what I'm saying?
You know, what's interesting. I actually believe, and I do believe it was extraterrestrial. I'll tell you what I was told.
Please.
So I had a chance to meet with Arcturians in 2017. It was not my first time. It was my second time.
Huh.
And my first time was I was 11 years old. I lived in a forest in England called Rendlesham Forest. It's a very famous UFO event.
You were 11 years old?
I was 11 years old.
No way.
Mm-hmm. And I had this very weird experience just last week. It's so crazy. This guy, I get people sending me stuff all the time. I'll tell you one thing that was bizarre. Some guy sent me this whole package of stuff, and I see all the addressees on the package. One of them was Elon Musk. The other one was like Department of Defense. The other one was NASA. The other was the White House. And so it was from this astrophysicist. He sent this giant package. And he's like, I sent it to people I thought could make something of this. He's an astrophysicist from Idaho. And he basically says, I've been doing calculations, and I believe that NASA has miscalculated the trajectory of the Apophis asteroid, which is supposed to come dangerously close to Earth, has a 1 in 37 chance of hitting Earth.
Whoa.
Which is quite large. It's like the same size as the Empire State Building, this asteroid. And it's supposed to swing by Earth within 18,000 miles, which is not very much. The Earth is moving at 67,000 miles per hour.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's like, about a third of an hour, a little less than that. So 20 minutes distance. And it's going to come within 2 Earth lengths almost, because 2 Earth lengths would be 16,000 miles.
No way.
Of hitting Earth. And he said that they used the wrong equation for the trajectory calculation, and that he believes the chance is much higher. So I feel like I'm like watching that movie, Don't Look Up, right?
Yeah.
I'm like, what the heck? I'm like, well, I hope some people got this one figured out. And he believes that they were using the wrong calculation for the Euler number. And I looked him up, and he's not a dumb guy. Mm-hmm. He's definitely well trained. So it's kind of interesting that I get this type of stuff every once in a while.
Yeah.
Last week, 2 weeks ago, I had this guy right before I left to go to Brazil. This guy reaches out to me, and he's a chemist, and he makes antennas. This is fascinating. So he starts sending signals from these antennas out into outer space. Mm-hmm. And the signals start coming back to him. So it's like communicating back with him. It's bouncing back the signal to him.
It could never come back on its own.
No. And these are gigantic antennas, right? And the guy's an expert in this. So he's also a physicist, a chemist. He's a very smart guy. And he said he sent it back to me. I mean, he sent it back, and he started sending messages like, show me a triangle of this exact shape, right? Which is a scalene triangle. It's a golden ratio proportion scalene triangle. And then he has the documented evidence that they actually show the lights in the sky of a triangle of that exact same shape. So he's like communicating back and forth with some extraterrestrial or intraterrestrial beings, right, that are showing up stuff far, far off in the distance, but showing up like almost like LED screen type stuff off far in the distance. And he says, all of this comes back to the fine structure constant. And so he starts telling me that the speed of light can be derived as 432, which is a Hertz frequency, divided by 144.1. And that comes out to 299.9792, which is speed of light. So the 144.1. And I've been thinking about that a lot because I've been thinking about the 144,000. I knew the eclipse had some relationship to that as well, intuitively. And 144 million, and it's actually 144 million, 144,000. And so it's like the players in the game, the starseeds from outside the game, are the 144,000.
Oh, that makes sense.
Right? I mean, one of the things I learned in making the game I showed you is that there's a theoretical limit on complexity for game theory. The complexity limit is 144,000 players.
Wow. Just like the Mormons say.
Right. Yeah, it's like, wait a minute. So the complexity limit, and after that, it already hits like an infinite amount of possible permutations.
Yeah.
So you don't get any more juice beyond that.
I see.
And so then all the rest of the people in the game would just necessarily be part of the game.
Like NPCs.
Yeah, they're not necessary. I saw that with your thing with Andre. they're just like us. They're just in their first incarnation.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? So the universe is constantly churning out, or universes is constantly churning out more souls, right? More divisions of the number one.
More experiments.
More experiments, more emotional states, right? And the emotional states is what we call space-time memory, right? We get this collection of all these different emotional states.
So is this what the Arcturians told you?
Yeah, it's related. So this guy comes to me and he says, he's telling me about this 432 divided by 144.1. And right at that moment, on my computer screen, pops up a message from Apple saying the new Sonoma upgrade is now available for download of version 14.4.1. So I saw that and I was like, I didn't even notice it was on his slide. And I took a screenshot. I'm like, whoa, that's a weird synchronicity. And then I look at the slide and I was like, oh my gosh. He had 144.1 right there. And I'm like, this is just too much coincidence. Mathematically, it doesn't fit, right?
That's a big wink.
It's a big wink, right? It's a big, big wink. So basically, I take the screenshot and I'm like, okay, I'm listening now. You have my fullest attention.
You have my attention.
And he starts telling me that the Arcturians met with him and they told him that all the stuff that was left at this Rendlesham incident, which there was this guy named Jim Peniston, he put his hand on this craft and he met beings that said they were from the future. Right. This is all released in the Freedom of Information Act.
Wow.
Right. So look it up. Rendlesham. Even Ancient Aliens did a thing on it. Right.
Humans from the future?
Humans from the future.
There was a guy on Redacted recently who said he had been abducted when he was a child like 4 or 5 times. And the being said, we're you from the future. We're humans from the future.
Yeah. And so they were kind of green color, but they're humans for the future.
He said they were green.
Okay. So they've gone up into, they're like a greenish blue.
4th density.
Right? Fourth, 5th density, right? 6th density also. So he says, this guy, when he put his hand on the spacecraft, he downloaded this long list of ones and zeros, a binary code. And they translated the binary code back into, hexadecimal and then back into, our regular system of letters and numbers and everything. And it turns out that one of the number sets was 1 over 137. Separation of light from darkness. Now, every year, the fine structure constant gets more and more accurate because we have better measurement systems at CERN Particle Collider to be able to measure it. And every year they've tested it against his because he's got like tons and tons of digits of accuracy. Every year it's been right since 1981.
Wow. And this is the code he received.
The code he received when he put his hand on the craft.
How have I not heard of this story before?
Yeah, now you're going to go look it up. You're going to be like, what in the wild? And not only that, but he also, in the same binary code, got the coordinates, the geocoordinates, for all the sacred sites around the world on the ley lines and the Nazca lines.
No way.
Yep.
Which means they were probably built by ETs.
Yep.
Or set up by ETs.
So then he blows my mind. Like at the end, he goes, and there's one other thing I need to tell you. And I said, what's that? Because I remember going out, it was after Christmas, day after Christmas, 1980.
You were how old?
I was 11.
Okay.
And I had been digging a trench in my backyard for my dad. We're making a retaining wall. And I was always a super hard worker, and I wanted to make sure, because it started raining, that there was a tarp that was covering it so that it didn't get all muddy, right? Because then it would be really hard to finish the job. So I went outside in the middle of the night to put the tarp on, and I saw the lights in the back, which is in the forest. And I don't remember a whole lot more than that.
Classic.
And I went back into my house, but I was fascinated. I remember looking, and I was like, wonder what this is all about. And I went back into my house, and then the same thing happened 2 nights later.
No way.
On December 26th and December 28th. And I didn't know that there was like a famous, like it was it was right next to Brentwater Air Force Base. And so, this whole thing happens. Well, this guy tells me, that had the call with me just 2 weeks ago, he said, they told me that was you visiting yourself. And that all of these numbers that were given in the coordinate system were for you to find later in life. And I was like, what? Are you kidding me?
So they told him specifically you, Robert Edward Grant.
Yes. So he reached out to me through Gaia. He knew one of the producers that I'd had in my first year of Codex, which is Sid Goldberg, and Sid connected us. Sid connected us, and so we ended up having a call. And I was like, at the end of it, kind of like, this is bizarre.
Yeah.
Right? Then I went on to Florianopolis and I made this discovery while I was there that Orion constellation is literally built into these 3 megalithic, sites that were exactly the Orion's belt. And at the very top of Dolmen's, one of them, was an entire Orion constellation in the form of like a Sarsen circle almost, like you would have at Stonehenge. And I can show you the pictures of it. It's unbelievable.
Wow.
Truly unbelievable. So all of this then makes me wonder how much of it is all just predestined. Mm-hmm. Because you start thinking about all of the intricacy that you would have to go through. Then that raises the question about the Stargate. So when I asked the Arcturians, I met them again in 2017, and I was there on a trip with Nassim Haramein. Mm-hmm. We came out, I was out of the King's Chamber, I laid on the stones in front of the Great Pyramid, and there were 50 of us laying outside, and we saw full formations of like 50 to 75 ships. Wow. They were all Arcturian. The Russian government reached out to the country of Egypt. We saw the email. They were asking who was in the pyramid that night because there was a huge electromagnetic pulse that was brought up on their satellite systems. And we all saw like these ships doing formations.
A Starfleet.
Yeah, 100%. This was October 5th, 2017. So later that night, I ended up getting visited by 2 Arcturians. And I asked them, when were the pyramids built? And they said, 13,000 years in your future.
That's like the infinite sequence that ends in a negative.
The Ouroboros.
My mind can't do it.
So they said that what we perceive as our distant past is actually also our distant future. And that time loops on itself as a Mobius strip, which was mind-boggling to me.
For sure. Do they mean then that a future version of humanity in 13,000 years traveled back in time, 26,000 years,
yes,
built the pyramids?
Yeah. So we're always at the other side of our time. So we're in a 24,000 year cycle. Half the cycle is 13,000 years. The other half the cycle is 11. As we get closer to Sirius A, our sister star, we go faster. It slingshots around.
Oh, wow.
So it's a 24,000 year cycle for the 24 notes of the quarter tone scale.
Oh, wow.
Which unites all musical systems in the world. The pentatonic scales, everything all falls within 24 note scale. And back to that 24ness, which is what's the 24th letter of the alphabet, even in English, is X. Right? So this, I was kind of like, wait, what? How could this be? And when you start thinking about how consciousness separates itself, and then also you start realizing we didn't have a latitude and longitude, 4,500 years ago when the pyramids were supposed to have been built. How is it that the pyramids built on one line of the speed of light and the other line is gravity and time, because time and gravity are linked?
Yeah.
That's mass time dilation. And then you start thinking, okay, well, what are the units of measure used to build the pyramid? And we realized that all 3 measurements were used, the meter, the foot, and the Royal Egyptian cubit. The perimeter of the King's Chamber is 31.4159262 meters. It's pi times 10 in meters. So what? The foot is an intrinsic part of the Great Pyramid's building. And if you haven't learned that yet, find it on Alan Green's work. He did an amazing presentation proving it, like unequivocally.
Wow.
And that each of our measurement systems are actually related to mathematical constants. It's simply 6, which is the fathom in feet, father and mother, fathom, mother backwards, is what we can get our arms around, right? Fathom in the universe. 6 minus the meter equals the Euler number. So 6 feet minus 3.281 feet equals 2.718, which is the Euler number, which is like pi for squares, right? And then you take 1 subtracted from that. So the 2.718 that's left over, you subtract 1 foot from that, and you end up with the Royal Egyptian cubit exactly. So the meter is 6 feet minus the Euler number, and the Euler number minus 1 foot is equal to the Royal Egyptian cubit. And all three measurement systems are used to build the pyramid. And not only that, but time. So if I take a circle with a radius of 1 meter and make that a pendulum, right, plumb bob, and I swing the plumb bob 30 degrees of arc, it will take exactly 1 second for the plumb bob to swing 1.718 feet, the Royal Egyptian cubit. So it's a clock of time. So you've got foot, meter, cubit, and time. It will swing 86,400 seconds. It'll swing each direction, right? 86,400 times. So obviously there's something way more advanced that seems so much farther out in the future.
Yeah.
The meter was supposed to have been made in 1799. Clearly it's not.
Discovered, maybe.
Discovered, right? 1799. And you know, we thought that the foot was just some arbitrary measure related to some guy's foot that was a king at some point in time. No, it's definitely not. It relates to the speed of light. Even the time it takes for light to traverse 1 foot, right, is exactly 1 second times 10 to the negative 9th power.
Yeah. You know, it does remind me of not Inception, but Interstellar with Matthew McConaughey when he's speaking through the bookshelf to, is it himself? In the past?
He's in the future changing the past.
Exactly. It's like that, where if you were trying to interact with or communicate to beings from the past, you would have to do it using like mathematical formulas and ratios and things that could stand out as impossible to be coincidence. You know, you can't like tap someone on the shoulder and like talk to them necessarily. You can impress codes, so to speak, that now we look at the pyramids and it's like, clearly someone put this here to be a communication device.
It's this top. To me, it is a reminder that we're in a matrix of our own making.
Exactly.
And it's the reminder to wake up, and it's a spiritual ascension Stargate.
Right.
And that as we go to the next level of this game, we now have access. Just like a grasshopper thinks its universe is the field that it lives in. It doesn't know beyond that. It's never been out beyond that.
Ooh. Okay, so
and then it reincarnates and comes back as a monkey in Brazil. And now it's got an expanded list of flora and fauna to interact with. And then it dies and comes back in rural Alabama and maybe never traveled before and, you know, thinks the earth is a certain way and believes that I heard that, you know, the sky is really blue in Alaska, but I've never been there. And then comes back as a metropolitan adventure woman, right, who's been everywhere, speaks, you know, multiple languages. The next step of the expansion of flora and fauna is extra and interterrestrial. It's just an expansion of our own consciousness.
Right.
It's like up-leveling in a game, and there's now new characters that show up in the game. And I think what the pyramid does is it wakes us up at those meridians in time that we are intended to up-level. And that happens at the transition of aeons, which is the 2,000-year cycle clock.
Right. We touched on that.
So time actually goes forward and backwards at the same time. And for it to be forward and backwards at the same time, that means that the past and the present determine the future, but likewise, the future and the present determine the past. We get Mandela effects.
Yeah.
Right? So this is not as crazy or as outlandish as it seems. What they explained is that they left Earth a long time ago. It's like a biosphere for them now.
Yeah.
It's a place where it's like a school. We get to come back, and as in a future Arcturian sense of us, right? And it's originally they also said it's not the Ark of the Covenant, it's the Arcturian Covenant. And that all of this, when you say collectively Ra, right? Who was it that built the pyramids? And what they told me, it was the people that were living here would have been Atlanteans. We're about to go through a cycle where Atlantis and Lemuria, what we think of as our distant history of Lemuria, might actually be our future.
Future humans.
We're going to create the new Lemuria.
Oh, man, that's amazing.
Right.
I never thought about it like that.
When you think of it in that sense, then all the changes that happen to Earth, maybe it's just a cycle. I was just in Brazil.
Of course.
I discovered probably 3 or 4 entire Egyptian-style pyramids that are under silt layered. You could see the steps of them on the outside of it that no one even knows about, and they're massive.
Wow.
Within 2 hours of Florianopolis, and also from Alto Paraiso, which is where this place is full. It's like called the High Paradise, where it's like full of waterfalls. It's just beautiful. There's pyramids all over the place that no one even knows about. And you can see them. They're like they're way better than anything I've seen in Bosnia, anything I've seen in Antarctica. There's a whole history that we're missing, that as we raise our consciousness, everything that was left in our historical reference in higher dimension is not visible to us. The higher dimensional history will come back as we raise our consciousness. It's not the world that changes, it's us that changes our perception, that we can see it.
So do you think that pyramids are kind of like perhaps nexus points that are built around the planet by future us?
Yes.
Going into the past, knowing like humanity.
And I think it's a raw collective. It's like a raw collective. So you've got Arcturians, you've got Palladians, you've got Syrians, you've got, the designers. I know already that the pyramid, without any doubt, the complex was built all around at the same time and all based on Metatron's cube. It's all flower of life. And just last week in Brazil, I discovered in a sarcophagus at the same place where the Orion constellation is, on the underside of one of the rocks that was propped up on 3 other large rocks and stones, was a full flower of life and Alpha Chi Omega right in the center. That is the Arcturian mothership, the Athena logo on the side.
The logo.
The Alpha Chi Omega. And we found it in every sarcophagus in the Serapeum in the Valley of the Kings. It's hidden underneath the hieroglyphics sometimes, but it's always there. So there's a whole history that I think we're about to, it's like remember your future.
Yeah.
And that is what I feel is actually happening, the realization that we're at the center of our own time matrix. We're only limited within that matrix by our own belief systems. And a critical aspect of this is to choose non-judgment. The more we choose non-judgment and love, and when we choose enlightenment, which I believe is when your expression of love supersedes and exceeds your desire for one objective truth, then you place love above all else.
Yes.
And relationships are easier, right? It's like the merger of masculine and feminine. The feminine rises. It's the pathos merging with the logos. And then your entire world shifts into a zone where you can expect miracles. And miracles happen literally every day.
It's like biogeometry for the whole planet.
Yes.
Like you set up biogeometry in your room to make the energy configuration harmonious. Maybe it's like a matrix grid built by us to intangibly affect consciousness.
And we don't find it until we raise our consciousness.
Right.
Because even the pyramid itself, each of the chambers within it only become unlocked to our consciousness as we raise our vibration.
Yeah. It's like we can see it, but we can't perceive it yet because we don't have the awareness to see it yet.
It's all a mirror of consciousness.
Yeah.
Just like now I walk in the pyramid. The first time I walked in the King's Chamber, I didn't see all this stuff on the walls.
Right.
Now it's like I can't unsee it.
Can't unsee it.
It's everywhere. Literally everywhere.
So is that what the Stargate is then? Do you think it's not like going somewhere Stargate, but it's like a portal to knowledge and remembering Stargate?
I think it's both.
Okay.
I think it's both. I've been out the ceiling. I've literally been out the ceiling and been for 5 hours. I felt like I was gone forever too.
Just in the stars or?
Yeah. There's a wormhole. And I'm not the only one who said this. There's a lot of people that have experienced this.
Yeah.
And I went through this wormhole. I went to the Bodhist system. I went to Pleiades. I went to Sirius. I got to see all of it. And then they're like, "Do you want to see more?" And I'm like, "No, I'll go home now." Like, I'm like, "How long have I been gone?" type thing. And so and my body was still in this autonomic cycle of, I would go, because the Hertz frequency resonance of the sarcophagus is 117 Hertz. Well, 11 over 7 is the base over the height of the Great Pyramid.
Oh, wow.
And 11.7 squared is 137. And the number of times the sarcophagus fits in the King's Chamber is 137 times. Volumetrically.
Unreal.
It's all coming back to Alpha Omega. And now we're just moving into the next stage, choosing love. And the Stargate is tied to each of the blocks in the walls. Each block in the wall is irregular and has a different X, Y, Z axis value.
That's so wild. I've never heard anyone say that.
Yeah, it's
but that's like a big deal.
It's a big deal.
That's huge.
It's a very big deal. And I believe that we can access, without building any spaceship or time travel machine or anything, We can access all these. It's just the next level of
For sure.
expansion of human consciousness.
For
Going
sure.
from the grasshopper in the field up leveling maybe more than a couple of, life incarnations, and going straight to, okay, now we are intergalactic beings. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what is coming next.
I agree.
That's what I really believe.
Do you remember the part in the Law of One where they ask Ra, like, can we still use the pyramids for these effects that they were built for now?
Yeah, and he said it was kind of like not working the same way.
He said it's like an out of tune piano. You can still use it, and it won't have the same level of effect, but you can still use it for that.
Yeah. Well, that's what we went and did in December.
Yeah.
When I found that the relationship of the pyramids, 3 pyramids, was based on the musical chords, right, of the intervals, which was the perfect fourth, perfect fifth, the major third, the minor sixth, and the unison and doubled octave, as well as the diminished fifth. That all of those notes, so you got 8 notes in the 13-note scale on a regular 12-note scale, right? 13 musical intervals of 1 octave. 8 of them were in the exact order they should be with the pyramids, right? And then I found the step pyramid covered the major second and the minor seventh, and the Giza Plateau itself covered the minor second and the major seventh. And so wait, you got the entire scale now. But then I was missing one other note, which was the minor sixth and the minor third and the major sixth.
Yeah.
And that was a 67.4 degree angle. That's the one that's on Abu Rawash. And then I realized, well, there's a pyramid behind it. It's equilateral. And where is that one? And then I found that was in a 528 scale. All the other ones are in 432. And the 2 are scales that intertwine with each other into one scale of 24 notes.
Isn't 432 the heart, 528's the throat?
528 is, some believe that's the heart, right? So,
okay.
But 432 is, I've always considered it like Thoth's constant, right? It's Euler to the power of pi equals 1 over 432 times 10. It's basically 10 to the 4th power over 432. And 4321, there's an inscription that I believe it's on the outside of the pyramid under the chevrons in the basin. And it's actually raised, so it's embossed, right? And the inscription has the letter V, a minus sign, a circle with a horizontal line in it,
I've seen that.
a circle with 2 vertical lines, and a circle with 3 horizontal lines, and a circle with 2 vertical lines. So it could say 5 minus 1, which is 4, just like the Roman numerals do, right? So you got a 1 and then a V, so that's like 4,
Yeah.
right? So 5 minus 1. So it could say 4, 3, 2, which makes sense because the entire Giza Plateau complex is 5 over 4 for Menkaure Pyramid, height over the half base, 4 over 3 for the Khafre Pyramid, the second pyramid, and the Great Pyramid is 2 over 1 pi. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Interesting.
It's right there. It's just the musicality of it. So when I realized that that's what was determining the slope angle of the pyramids, and then we decided, I took this whole group of 50 people to Egypt. They were all big influencers, and we were activating using those notes. The exact notes and precise temperament tuning. We were singing the notes to activate all those pyramids, and then also the Abu Rawash complex. We did the same thing. And, the intent was like a tuning fork to tune the pyramids back.
Retune it. Do you think it worked?
Yeah. They're turned on. And we're not the only ones that have been doing it. This was a lot of people, thousands of people have been going to Giza and doing activation work they just felt called to do.
Wow.
Right? And they've been doing their own thing, and that all was a critical aspect of it. The beauty of this trip was that there were no leaders on this trip. Everyone was a leader, and yet no one was the leader.
Yeah, like the New Earth.
Like the New Earth. There was respect. There was incredible respect. We had incredible rock star people there like Zach Bush and Matthias DiStefano and Billy Carson and, Danica Patrick and Blue of Earth and Vailana and all these amazing souls that were there. And, but I didn't have to be the leader and no one did.
See, because you're all following the one law.
Yeah. And I think that's the the thing that was most beautiful to me is how it worked so harmoniously and beautifully without having to have any hierarchy.
Yeah.
And I hope that that's where the world's going. And I think in order to have that, everyone has to have free voices. They have to be authentic, and that's the throat chakra.
Yeah.
Throat chakra. So once you move beyond, the heart, which is you're going to choose love over judgment.
Yeah.
You release the judgment frequency.
Yeah.
Right? It stays in lower dimension.
Yep.
You realize that it served a purpose, and that all the suffering you experienced as a result of it, I believe that judgment is the source of all suffering. Mm-hmm. All the suffering that you experienced was all for a reason.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like when you finally realize math has a meaning, it's like, whoa, it's God, right? Mm-hmm. Then when you finally realize that the duality and the suffering has a meaning, you're like, wow, it's God. And it's beautiful, and I'll end on one last thing, which is the square root of 2, which is essence of duality. The diminished fifth is the square root of 2.
Oh, wow.
And you just multiply that by a unison note, 1.4142, right? And that splits exactly the octave, right in the middle. Even though it's logarithmic, it splits it exactly perfectly. Wow. So it's the foundational basis of all of our musical notes, because in an equal temperament system for music, it's the 1/12th root of 2 is the first note. The second 12th root of 2 is the third note. The third 12th root of 2 is the fourth note, and so on all the way up. It's just roots of 2. Mm. So the foundational basis of all experience here, and the gradation of color and light associated with the music, is the root of 2.
No way.
So duality.
What a trip.
What a trip. Now, so the root of 2 is the infinite expression of a compressed number 2. So you could say the square root of 2 is an infinite form or essence of the number 2, because I can collapse that into one digit as a compressed value.
What does a compressed value mean?
So, like if I were going to do a compression in mathematics and computational science, I could say, okay, I'm going to compress at a 30% level this video file to make it more efficient and make it easier to transit from one party to another, right? But actually, inside of the square root value of numbers, as long as they're not perfect square values, is infinite compression. Mm-hmm. Because inside the square root of 2 is every conversation that's ever existed and every conversation that will ever exist.
All possibilities.
All possibilities. So I can have the most efficient compression from infinite number of digits that I can reproduce inside the square root of 2. I can compress it by taking it and just multiplying it, the square root of 2 value. And I can compress it into one digit. So I just transfer one digit to you, and you've got all the infinite information that you would ever need, because you can just decompress it by the mathematical function of square root.
And this doesn't work for the square root of 3 or any other number?
It does. It works for any square root value. Okay. So you can compress infinite amount of data on any square root value, that's as long as it's not a perfect square, like 4, because 4, its square root is just 2. Right? There's only one unit that you could use out of that. So you got an infinite value compression. So another way of looking at that is that the square root of 2 becomes the essence of duality, the spirit of duality. And what do we associate with the square root of 2 and duality? Suffering, difficulty, judgment, right? This or that. Yeah. Right? Good or evil, light or dark.
Attraction, aversion.
Exactly. But the square root of 3, when we think about the number 3, we think of what? Something divine.
Trinity.
Godhead, right? There's something divine. It's like Father, Son, Holy Mother, right? Abba, Amma, and the Son.
Yeah.
So its divine essence would be the square root of 3. So if I add the square root of 2 of duality to the square root of 3 of divinity, what's it equal? Pi.
No way. The square root of 2 plus the square root of 3?
Equals 3.146. It's a very close approximation for pi.
Amazing.
Yeah. So wait. So
it really is all math.
So suffering, the duality, plus the context of divinity comes full circle. Right? Because full circle is the circumference. A circle with the diameter of 1 will have a circumference of 3.14. So then if we take a step back and say, how much of that circle is represented by the square root of 2? So I simply take the 3.146 that those two numbers sum to, And I divide that number by the square root of 2. And then I take the reciprocal value of that. And the reciprocal value of that comes out to be 0.449. So I can now find the number of degrees that are represented on this holistic circle that includes the spirit of duality and the spirit of Trinity, divine aspect.
Mm-hmm.
And guess what it comes out to? The number of degrees of the square root of 2, which is all the suffering and the lead. And even the symbol of the square root of 2 looks like Saturn. It matches the Saturn symbol, which matches lead. Lead is the metal of Saturn in alchemy.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So now if I take that and find out what percentage of that circle, which is 0.449 of the overall circle, and I multiply that by 360 degrees to find the degrees of suffering of the circle without the divine aspect, it turns out to be 161.816 degrees. It's a perfect palindrome anagram relationship that is the golden number. 1618 is a golden number, and then 0.618, your wife's birthday, June 18th, is basically its reciprocal value that's also represented as its palindrome 816. So it's 161.816 degrees.
So it's like a mathematical equation saying that moving through duality or suffering leads to ascension, the golden ratio.
Lead turns to gold.
Lead turns to gold. Alchemy.
Alchemy. It's the context of the divine aspect.
Incredible.
The context of the divine aspect that we look back on our life and we say, that was the most difficult thing that ever happened to me, when we don't understand that suffering without meaning is just suffering.
Mm-hmm.
But suffering with the context of, hey, I'm on a divine path, on a hero's journey, and all my suffering has meaning now. And that meaning is the lead of that experience turning into gold because I changed my perspective on what it was.
I just talked about this actually in a video, that trauma is not just a painful experience happening to us, but it's actually not understanding why an experience happened. Not being able to see the lesson in the experience keeps it as a trauma, and you heal the trauma by seeing the lesson, the alchemy.
Yeah. We don't even remember the easy teachers in school. We remember the hard ones. Mm-hmm. We remember the hard coaches, the ones that pushed us harder than we thought we could ever withstand. The ones that stretched us and believed in us more than we believed in ourselves.
Yep.
I went to the Hall of Fame thing from my high school, and I had all these teachers, and I forgot I even had some of these teachers. The ones I really remembered were the ones that really, really challenged me the most.
Yeah.
Life is not different. We're in a school. The most challenging teachers of our life are the experiences. Mm-hmm. We wouldn't choose the easy path. Right. You wouldn't choose the easy path because it doesn't mean as much as if it's too easy. We're here to experience through opposites and through difficulty, because those are the greatest life lessons, and they're the ones that stretch us the most. Mm-hmm. They might break our ego, they won't break our heart, but we expand our consciousness through it all the way.
Yeah.
And I think that's what the true alchemy is, turning the lead of our experience, because now we have the context of understanding that, like math with meaning is now divine communication, suffering with context of divinity becomes the greatest gold experience that we could ever have.
Yeah. Dude, it's like I've just watched you put mathematics to all of the teachings that I know and love so much and share about so much. And like you've put them all into math for me to understand them from a geometrical. Like I've had my mind blown so many times in this podcast that I'm going to have to pick my brains up from this room. But I feel like I understand you better now, hearing about this story of the ET encounter at 11 years old or whatever.
Yeah.
Something must have been downloaded to you, man, to give you the mind that you have. It's truly remarkable, and I'm very grateful to have this conversation with you.
I'm grateful to have you here, and you're such a wisdom keeper, especially for your generation. How old are you now?
35.
35. So, I mean, people like you and Andre, you know, he's a bit younger than you are. Mm-hmm. You guys, what you're doing is like so phenomenal, because, you know, I never thought that I was in Brazil last week, and I'm walking around and like stunned that people would like walk up to me and they're like, "You've changed how I perceive math."
Oh, I bet.
And I was kind of blown away. And I'm walking in this tiny little town, Alto Paraiso, and people are like, "Oh, I follow you." They're like, I couldn't believe it, you know?
It happens in the strangest places sometimes.
Oh, yeah. And so it's all a reflection of our own you inverse, our own experience inside. Yeah. So the fact that I'm meeting you is a good sign for me, because the fact that you're intersecting with my life path says that there's something right and absolutely divine about where I am on the inside, that I would reflect someone of such high character and ability and talent as you. And I'm very honored to have met you, and I'm so grateful that we have so many. We have a lot of mutual friends and everything. And thank you so much for being here with me today, and sharing all of your great wisdom and knowledge about the Essenes, especially. I didn't know that you were such an expert on that.
Oh yeah, we barely tipped our toes in, man.
Yeah, well, we're definitely going to do this again. We're definitely going to do it again, and I'm happy to do something with you.
I would love that
when I'm in Austin in a week or so. So
yeah, I would love that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, brother. It's an honor.
Thank you. All right, well, we'll see you next time on Think Tank.